Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Badmouse has made a response to my video on the Kronstadt mutiny. Let's take a look at what he says. Badmouse makes a lot of fact claims. Obviously, I would like to take a lot of time and read a lot of books and things and check all the facts and all the stuff that is being said. Probably I could find more counter-arguments to what he says, but unfortunately I don't really have a lot of time right now, so I can't really do that. Instead, I'm just gonna talk based on the stuff I know currently.
Finn talks about Yeltsin praising the revolt, framed in such a way I can only assume is meant as a poisoning the well tactic. Opportunist politicians canonize old figures and movements all the time in service of their cause.
Is it poisoning the well? I don't know. I'm not really such an expert on these debate terms. Of course, it's true that Yeltsin is trying to appropriate the Kronstadt mutiny and he's trying to use any anti-communist movement. In the Kronstadt mutiny, there of course were some socialists and some anarchists. Yeltsin obviously didn't agree with those people, but I still think that the fact that Yeltsin praises it is indicative of what side the Kronstadt mutiny is on. Because in this video, Badmouse talks a lot about what the intentions of the rebels or mutineers was. He says this wasn't what they intended or that wasn't what they intended, and I think that that doesn't necessarily matter. It doesn't necessarily matter like what the subjective political motivation of the mutiny was. I think what matters more is that objectively it has turned into an anti-communist symbol, an anti-communist argument. That's how Yeltsin uses it, and that's also how capitalists during the Kronstadt mutiny used it. They didn't care that it's supposedly an anarchist movement or some kind of pseudo-socialist movement. They didn't care about that. They just see it as an anti-Bolshevik movement, and they're satisfied with that. And objectively speaking, that's what it became. Badmouse even pretty much admits that at the end of the video when he talks about the fact that the leaders of the Kronstadt mutiny escape to Finland, shake hands with the Finnish White Guards, and then decide to join the Russian White Army of Wrangel. Let's assume that that wasn't what they were trying to do. Well, that is still what it objectively became.
As for Petrochenko's desire to join the Whites, the source from this comes from a single reference in the New York Times article. There's no background given besides circumstantial motivation due to the squalid conditions he and his family were in. The issue that Finnboll makes, which will become more apparent, is that pushing so much of the attention behind the entire fleet towards a single person is not a good representation.
To understand this better, I think people should go and watch my original video. I'll link it in the description. But basically, Petrochenko was the leader of the Kronstadt mutiny, and he claimed to be a syndicalist. But before the uprising, he had tried to join the Whites. Then also after the uprising fails, he again tries to join the Whites, and this time successfully. But Badmouse basically says that it's not significant. It's really hard for me to understand this idea that the leader of the entire uprising was basically a White Guardist, or at least a wannabe White Guardist. I think that's what I said in the video. I think that is significant, especially when it comes to all the other ways that the uprising was connected to the White Guard. Now, of course, it is true that we shouldn't only look at the leader, we should look at the whole movement. But in my opinion, in the Kronstadt mutiny, there's a separation between the movement or the supporters of the mutiny and the leadership of the mutiny. And I know that Badmouse disagrees with this, but my interpretation always was that the movement may have been more broadly leftist, and in terms of class composition, mainly peasant, but also to an extent working class, while the leadership was mostly right-wing, white guard, capitalist, or fake socialist, and they basically just used fake socialist slogans to try to mislead their supporters. That was my main claim, and I know that Badmouse disagrees with it, but we'll get more into it as we proceed. In 1921, Russia was in ruins after years of World War I and Civil War. Fuel and food were always extremely scarce. As long as the Civil War lasted, the population basically understood and tolerated all these hardships.
Peasants did not just put up with the Soviet measures, as is inferred here. The actions resulted in many of them refusing to cooperate. And many times they actually reduced their production effort down to the bare means, because there was no point in them producing any more if it's just going to be taken away.
I think that's kind of nitpicking. Yes, it's true that throughout the entire period of the Civil War, there was both peasant collaboration with the Bolsheviks and also peasant resistance to the Bolsheviks. but that wasn't the point. The point was that during the Civil War, there was basically a working class party, the Bolsheviks, and a capitalist party, the Whites, and the peasants were kinda in the middle, and neither side was identical to the peasants, but the peasants had to pick a side, and by a large margin, they chose the Bolsheviks. The worker peasant Red Army was predominantly peasant. The peasants didn't want conscription, they didn't like food procurements, but by and large, they were willing to tolerate it because they had to choose a side, and both sides were doing conscription, and both sides were doing procurement, but the Whites seemed infinitely worse to the peasants, because the Whites wanted to restore the landed aristocracy, which the Bolsheviks did not want to do. And you're citing Orlando Figes. Orlando Figes is an anti-communist, of course, and I think his book, A People's Tragedy, is not particularly good, but on this topic he actually is pretty decent. He says the same thing that I just said. And he also has another book called Peasant Russia, which I think is much better. It goes more into detail about this. But basically the point is that the peasants predominantly collaborated with the Bolsheviks against the Whites during the Civil War, and they were willing to tolerate conscription, food procurement, etc. However, once the Civil War ends, there's no longer any reason why there should be conscription and food procurements and whatnot. So if it was justified before, the peasants no longer consider it justified during peacetime. And this basically amounts to the fact that the peasants didn't like the policy known as war communism, which was the Civil War era Bolshevik policy. And many historians claim, and I also think it's true, that the Kronstadt rebellion and other similar movements were mostly rebellions against war communism. And that's why they took place in 1921, when the war was coming to an end. The Bolsheviks then decide to get rid of war communism, and they replace it with the so-called new economic policy. And the new economic policy was actually, I think, pretty much already decided 2 weeks before the Kronstadt Mutiny takes place. I think it was only made official at the 10th Party Congress, which took place during the Kronstadt Mutiny.
Nevertheless, they were not simply idle actors, willing to put up with shit. They did try their best to resist requisitioning.
Yes, oftentimes they did try to resist food requisitioning, but, Figes also talks about this. There were moments when the Whites threatened the peasants, and the peasants decided that, okay, we gotta stop all our resistance to the Bolsheviks, otherwise the Whites are gonna win. Figes says that in peasant territories that were occupied by the Whites, and then the Bolsheviks kicked the Whites out from those territories provided the most peasant volunteers to the Red Army, and also all the territories that were in general threatened by the Whites provided more peasant volunteers to the Red Army, which just shows that, yeah, the peasants probably resisted requisitioning, whether it be from the Bolsheviks or whether it be from the Whites, but in general, they wanted to make sure that the Bolsheviks win and not the Whites.
There was unrest in Petrograd after several factories were closed down due to fuel shortages. False rumors of workers being shot and factories even being bombed in Petrograd were spread in the fortress town of Kronstadt.
We should know full well that discontent is often larger than it first might appear. Let's see what the peasants were also saying. Angry workmen called for the immediate scrapping of war communism in favor of a system of free labor. So assertive was this demand that the government sent emissaries to the factories to try and justify its policies. Workers took to the streets with banners and placards demanding free trade, higher rations, and the abolition of grain requisitions. Nor did they stop at economic demands.
I don't really disagree with what he's saying here. This is pretty much what I just said. People were calling for scrapping of war communism. It says here that they wanted a system of free labor. I think that probably means abolition of mandatory labor service. It says that there were placards that demanded free trade, higher rations, abolition of grain requisitioning. So basically just against war communism. And then it also says that here and there were even placards calling for the revival of the Constituent Assembly. But as is said later on in this video, the Kronstadt mutineers themselves never called for the Constituent Assembly. Even the capitalists eventually decide that they shouldn't call for the Constituent Assembly right away, because it's not a popular demand. Most people want a Soviet government. The right-wing Mensheviks and the right-wing SRs were calling for the Constituent Assembly, and also some of the capitalist cadet party So that's why I'm thinking that this call for a revival of the Constituent Assembly is probably just coming from Mensheviks. Katkov also, who is one of Avrich's sources, writes that although these resolutions oftentimes included Menshevik political demands, still the main concern of the strikes was economic grievances.
And to this latter point that the rebels were inspired to revolt simply because of these rumors, no. If you read on just a single page ahead, Avrich states that they sent out a delegation into Petrograd and came back with the discovery of a heavily militarized situation. Finn appears to have a habit of being a tad bit selective, as is shown in his next point, where he continues this rumors line.
Yeah, but I didn't invent it. It's Avrich who's talking about the rumors. I didn't pull that out of thin air, that's what Avrich says. This is basically what Badmouse says. He says that the Kronstadt people send a delegation to Petrograd. They see that there are strikes going on, they see that there's soldiers occupying factories, so then they go back and say that there's a general insurrection going on. That is a rumor. Even though they went there and looked around and then went back, it's still a rumor. They were the ones who were spreading the rumor.
Quote, the Petrograd strikes were on the wane, but the rumors of shootings and full-scale rioting had already aroused the sailors, and on March 2nd, at a time when the disturbances had all but ceased, they were drafting the erroneous announcement for publication the following day that the city was in the throes of a general insurrection.
I take great issue with your use of this ellipse here. The full reading of Avrich's words reveals some much-needed information. It was true, moreover, that the Petrograd strikes were on the wane, having reached a peak on the last day of February.
I don't know, man. Does that really make a big difference? Obviously, I don't remember why I put the ellipses there, but I'm assuming that it was just to make the text flow better. Since the video is basically constructed from snippets taken from sources, I sometimes have to put in ellipses and things to make the text flow at least somewhat. And a thing that happens in political discussion is that oftentimes people accuse each other of lying, saying, oh, you're lying, no, you're lying. Like, obviously some people are lying, but I think most of the time it's not intentional, or at least not fully intentional. I think it's more often the result either of just a mistake or it's just bias, unintentional bias. Like, sometimes people tell me like, oh, you're lying, blah, 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 but like, no, it's just my opinion. If you don't agree with it, then you don't agree with it. If you think it's wrong or false, that's one thing, but I'm not intentionally lying. And the same goes for this video. Like, Badmouse says that he disagrees with my use of the ellipses and certain things that I say, and that I'm like misrepresenting or being dishonest. But I think that everything I said is completely true. Well, there's a couple things that I know that I got wrong, but he doesn't even mention them because those are insignificant. But throughout this whole video, Badmouse just disagrees with me. He disagrees with my interpretation. Enough of that side tangent, let's get back to the actual point. So I took out this part that says, having reached a peak on the last day of February. So the whole thing says, it was true, moreover, that the Petrograd strikes were on the wane, having reached a peak on the last day of February. But the rumors of shootings and full-scale rioting had already aroused the sailors, and on March 2nd, at the time when the disturbances had all but ceased, they were drafting the erroneous announcement, yada yada yada, claiming that the city was in the midst of a general insurrection. How does this little snippet, like having reached a peak on the last day of February, change anything? My claim in the video was that the Kronstadt rebels were spreading misinformation, saying that there's a general insurrection in Petrograd, which there wasn't, and that there were mass killings, which there weren't, and they were spreading that narrative so that they could get people to support an uprising against the Bolsheviks. Right? Makes sense. But Badmouse says, no, they went to Petrograd, saw that there were strikes and soldiers patrolling and whatnot, therefore they mistakenly thought that there were mass killings and a general insurrection. And he's saying that basically because they went there at the end of February and they saw the strikes and the soldiers, therefore a few days later they start their own uprising. So therefore what they said wasn't lies or something, or that even if it was lies, it was by accident. That's basically what Badmouse is trying to say. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if they went there in January, it doesn't matter if they went there in February. They didn't see a general insurrection at any time. It is just a false rumor that they were spreading. So my point stands. I said that they're spreading this false rumor about an uprising, and that's exactly what they were doing. So I think he's trying to make like a very small point into something significant when it really doesn't change anything. If you even read the rest of the quote, it still says the same thing, that the rumors had already aroused the sailors, even though the disturbances had all but ceased. But they had already aroused the soldiers. How does it add anything to say that it had aroused the soldiers in February?
I can excuse the leaving out of immediate previous or following text from time to time. Unfortunately, Finn does this neglection on no less than 12 occasions.
Yeah, but you say you can excuse leaving out stuff immediately before or immediately after, but that's literally what a quote is. It's always gonna leave out stuff that's immediately before and immediately after. What does that mean? It's not like Avrich says, oh yeah, the Kronstadt mutineers were bad, and then I just quote that, and then immediately after he says, psych, no they weren't. Nothing like that happens. However, if there are moments where you think I'm misquoting something, it's completely fair to point it out. But I just really disagree with this whole argument.
A mass meeting was held in Kronstadt on March 1st, where anti-communist statements and lies were spread. The meeting was orchestrated in such a way that communists were not allowed to speak. The topic was raised that new elections to the Soviet should be carried out. A delegate meeting of soldiers was held the next day on March 2nd. In this meeting, it was proposed that all communists should be arrested. The delegates were amazed.
Finball ends it there, but once more, some information is missing. Here is the original mention by Avrich, containing again some crucial context. This was a minority of people. The majority of the delegation did not want to do this.
This is confusing to me because I never said that the majority of delegates wanted to arrest the communists. In fact, I said the opposite. Because what I actually said was that they had a meeting, the leadership says that they should arrest the communists, the delegates were amazed, and, you know, if they had been fully on board with it, they probably wouldn't have been amazed. And then I say that the leadership invents a new rumor, saying that the communists are coming to kill us, so we have to quickly arrest all of them before they can kill us. And only then they arrest all the communists. Now, Badmouse doesn't actually disagree with that, because that is exactly what happened. So I don't really understand this, like, what significance does this point have? And furthermore, what Badmouse is saying in no way contradicts my whole argument. My argument consistently throughout the video was that the top leadership of the uprising was acting undemocratically, basically carrying out a coup or a conspiracy, and that their supporters didn't know what the leadership was planning, and that their supporters weren't really on board with what the leadership was doing. So this idea that the delegates maybe wouldn't have arrested the communists, but the leadership wants to, and then the leadership tricks them into it, that fits perfectly with my argument, and that is indeed what I was saying throughout the whole video.
However, the organizers of the mutiny made the completely baseless and hysterical claim that armed communist detachments were about to surround the meeting and arrest everyone. Therefore, it was supposedly justified and necessary to immediately quickly begin rounding up and arresting all the communists. Quickly arrest them, they're coming to get us. This type of fear propaganda was cleverly used by the mutineers. Delegates had no time to think, they had no access to information, and communists had no chance to speak.
Leaving the conversation there leads the viewers to the conclusion that this was a coup attempt and that they took part through conspiracy. Once more, he does not go on to read the rest of Avrich's research, which states that at the time there were valid reasons to believe that an imminent attack was about to occur.
So once again, Badmouse doesn't really contest the actual facts of what I'm saying. He doesn't deny any of the things that I said. Like, what I said is true, at least according to the source, and we're both using the same source. So that's exactly what happened. But then Badmouse says that it's wrong for me to interpret that as a coup. Okay, well that's his opinion, but I think it is a coup. Then he says that the reason it wasn't a coup or a conspiracy is that it was basically just an accident. They weren't just spreading misinformation in order to create panic so that they could justify arresting the communists. Instead, they just mistakenly thought that the communists were coming to kill them, and that's why they did what they did. What is his proof for this? Well, Avrich says that the previous day, some communists had wanted to stop the uprising. However, it's unclear if the leaders of the uprising even knew about that. But more importantly, during the meeting where they decided to arrest all the communists, they saw that a group of communists left from a party school, and they actually left the whole city. So supposedly, they saw that and thought, oh, that's the communists coming to kill us. Avrich isn't even very certain of that. He just says that what may have inspired the rumor. And besides, what makes it seem more like a coup to me is the fact that they suggested arresting the communists and it didn't work. And then they invent this new rumor like, oh shit, they're coming to kill us, we gotta arrest them right now. And then it works. Okay, let's talk about sources. How is the history of the Soviet Union and communism in general written? The field is of course entirely controlled by capitalist and anti-communist writers. They control literally all the schools where this history is taught and where historians are trained. They have access to all the sources, the archives, the rare books. They have all the time, the resources and the manpower to research and write. They have all this stuff, so they can make all kinds of distortions, and it's very difficult for us to know about it, because we don't have access to any of that stuff. This already puts the workers and communists at a disadvantage. Furthermore, the burden of proof has been shifted so that communist claims are automatically assumed to be false, or at least suspect. A communist needs to prove his claims extremely well. He must have sources for everything. Meanwhile, if you read a capitalist history book, they sometimes have very few sources, and that is beside the fact that even the few sources they have are often simply not good. It's easy for anybody to make an anti-communist piece and it'll probably be believed, at least in the developed imperialist countries, in the Western countries and North America. And that kind of stuff also passes peer review easily, even if it doesn't have any or barely any sources. Now, this might sound too incredible, it might just sound like woo-woo, tinfoil hat, whatever, but I'll give you a couple examples in just a second. Communists simply cannot use the same methods that capitalists use. Communists must have sources, and the sources also cannot be communist sources because it will be automatically assumed that they are lies. So therefore, a communist is forced to use predominantly the works of anti-communists, in other words, inaccurate works of his political enemies, as his main sources and his main proof. Which is quite a weird situation, but that is the situation. Personally, I always mainly quote from the sources, because I think that if I just make a claim and then add a footnote, which is what a lot of people do, then I think it'll just be dismissed. But if I give a direct quote, then it's less easy to just ignore it as communist lies. In my original Kronstadt video, I mostly used Avrich as a source, and I didn't really even attempt to rely on communist sources because we either don't have access to them or they'll just be dismissed. Avrich is very biased in favor of anarchism. I think he might be an anarchist, but I'm not absolutely sure. He makes all kinds of distortions and falsifications on behalf of anarchism and against communism. He constantly tries to make anarchism look good and communism look bad. However, even when we are reading someone who is pro-anarchist or anti-communist or what have you, the truth oftentimes seeps through, so to say, between the lines. So when we're reading between the lines, we can get some kind of idea what really happened, although Avrich tries to spin it and tries to make it seem better for the mutineers. Capitalists, anarchists, revisionists, liberals, they don't really consider that they might want to question their own sources. Because part of the capitalist brainwashing is that their sources are considered not only accurate, but even neutral and objective and not capitalist. But the very concept of neutral and non-ideological history is of course not only impossible, but also a capitalist concept. Because a historian is always influenced by his environment, his teachers, what he was taught, what sources he uses, his own beliefs, etc., etc. Nobody is objective. Objectivity in an absolute sense does not exist. The best we can do is everybody can put forward his point of view, and everybody should realize what their own bias, what their own ideology is, and then just make sure that they don't literally falsify sources or make any other mistakes like that. But capitalist ideology does not think like that. They don't really criticize their own sources like that. They take them pretty much at face value, whereas I never even tried to rely solely on communist sources, but instead used them only sparingly, and even in those cases, the communist sources in question usually have other sources. Imagine if I had only cited the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and nothing else. I did actually cite a couple things from an official Soviet history book just to add a little bit of color, but imagine if that was all I did. Or imagine if I only relied on, this is what Lenin says, therefore it's true, and that's the end of the discussion. But that is basically what anti-communists do, and I will now proceed to demonstrate it. So what kind of sources does Avrich use? For the other chapters that don't talk about this, he has some other sources, but when he's actually talking about the mutiny, he mainly uses writings of the Kronstadt mutineers themselves. He never questions them, never criticizes them. He presents them as reliable and as a truthful depiction of what really happened. And he basically just parrots what they say. The statements of the mutineers are mainly published in the magazine that Kerensky wrote for, which is the White Guard and Right SR Volia Rossi. That's where Avrich gets them. There is no evidence that the Whites even published these materials accurately, although for the most part they might have. Avrich repeats very long passages from this White Guard publication, and when I say that he repeats it, I don't mean that he quotes it, I mean that he just tells the same story. All the stuff that happens, all the events of the uprising, given in Avrich's book, they are just taken from Volia Rossi. Almost word for word, although he doesn't give it as a quote. And Volia Rossi itself has no sources or evidence to support any of its own claims. So let's take a look. These are sources that Avrich uses for the main sections where he's talking about the uprising. He cites Pravda o Kronstadt, which is a text written by the mutineers themselves, published in Volia Rossi. And then for less important facts, he cites anarchist Berkman, who is totally unreliable and provably wrong about even basic facts. Badmouse points out that Berkman says that Kozlovsky wasn't even at Kronstadt, which is obviously wrong. And I think Berkman either believed this lie, which was spread by the mutineers, or maybe he knew it to be a lie but spread it nonetheless, I'm not sure. And as you can see, Avrich even says that Pravda o Kronstadt is the most valuable source on the mutiny. For some completely insignificant details, Avrich might cite some other sources, such as Raskaya Zizin, which is another white émigré paper published in Finland and Prague. And then Avrich also cites anarchist Volin, and also even Lenin, but those don't actually matter because he only cites them when they say what their opinion was, and it's not actually anything about the actual events of the uprising. Now that I looked at this more carefully, Avrich actually has an amazing lack of credible sources, which I didn't even originally notice. On many pages, there are all kinds of claims that are made, and there are no sources whatsoever. And occasionally only one source about something very unimportant, such as, for example, statements by Zinoviev and Kamenev against the October Revolution, which really has nothing to do with anything. You know, imagine only citing the mutineers themselves as the only source. That would literally be like me only citing Lenin and nothing else. Here's some other of his sources. That's Volia Rossi again, and then a text by Petrichenko. He's the leader of the mutiny. On some other pages there are some other sources, so let's take a look at them. One is simply speculating that Kronstadt was influenced by the ideology of left SR maximalism, and then it cites a text where the SR maximalists describe their ideas. And then there's another exactly similar source trying to say that the rebels had SR or maximalist influence, and it cites a maximalist and an SR source. But other than that, it's just White Guard publications all the way. Even the stuff about the supposed justifications that caused the rumors and whatnot, it's all just from Volia Rossi and nothing else. So actually, for half the stuff that Avrich says, there isn't a shred of objective or reliable proof. But I think that the stuff that I quoted him on is pretty well established from other sources. What are some other sources that Badmouse uses? He cites Victor Serge and also Volin. Victor Serge's Memoirs is mostly about totally different things that don't really have anything to do with Kronstadt, and there is zero evidence for any of his claims about Kronstadt. Serge was an anarchist who later supported Trotsky, but then still remained influenced by anarchism, and later he became some kind of revisionist who said that proletarian revolutions are no longer possible, and he also said that people should support far-right capitalist forces like de Gaulle in France in the late 1940s as a better alternative to the USSR. You can read about his ideas in his memoirs. his actual ideas are not super important. My only point is that he is totally biased against the USSR. And I'm not even necessarily saying that he's necessarily lying about most things. I just think that his ideology is anti-communist, and that colors his interpretation of events. A much more relevant source is Volin. He was an anarchist writer who worked as Makhno's propaganda chief, as far as I know. Now, does he have any proof or sources for anything that he claims? No, absolutely nothing. Victor, Serge, and Volin, they both have this sort of overarching theme in their books where they claim basically that the communists are always lying and that they're the only ones speaking the truth. And Volin outright says that Volin's books are the only non-biased books on the whole Russian Revolution, which is laughable. It's utterly laughable, because he's extremely biased. For example, Volin doesn't say a word about the Kronstadt mutineers joining with Wrangel or meeting with white agents, etc., even though that happened. But I still think that Serge and Volin both probably believed a lot of what they said. They truly didn't think that they were pawns of the capitalists. They both left Russia, went into emigration, they didn't get rich, they didn't get famous, they didn't get anything for it. And it seems like they were just doing what they wanted to do. But then, after they died, their books were taken by the capitalists and were used and are used as weapons against communism. And I think Serge and Volin probably truly did not understand that that would happen. I also checked some of Avrich's other sources. Besides Volyarossi, his most important source is Katkov, and Katkov's work is apparently considered one of the best on the topic of the Kronstadt mutiny. But Katkov also repeats almost word for word very long passages either taken from Volin or from the White Guard Volyarossi or other statements by the Kronstadt mutineers themselves. Katkov doesn't actually cite any sources at all. He doesn't have any footnotes. Only at the end of his text he adds a note where he says that the main sources on the mutiny are Volyarossi, as well as statements of Petrichenko, and he also mentions a couple Soviet works, which he dismisses as incredible, and then he also mentions anarchist writers like Berkman and Goldman without any sources and provably inaccurate, and then he also briefly cites Victor Serge. So what we can see from this is that we've ended up in a situation where the writers Volin, Serge, Katkov, and Avrich, they either all just cite Volyarossi, or they cite each other. And I think that this is how lies are manufactured, because that gives an impression that there's some truth or some facts behind all of this, that there's this whole literature about this. But it's just a network of nothing, it's just circular. And they all do their best to debunk or attack the communists, but none of it actually amounts to anything. And then they make statements like this. This is from Katkov. He says, quote, "Victor Serge did not for a moment believe the story of the White Guardist plot," unquote. As if that's supposed to prove something. They repeat the same arguments that we've already heard during this video, so I'm not going to go into it here. The fact that the Mensheviks and anarchists and liberals and revisionists and others fully support the capitalist narrative about Kronstadt, and the fact that the capitalists also fully echo the narrative of those people, demonstrates their class character. It doesn't mean that they have an official agreement, it doesn't mean that they even think about it, but they still do it. Another important writer on the topic is Getzler, but I'll talk about him at a different point in this video.
I have always seen throughout Soviet apologia the use of, well, they were frightened, they were paranoid, they were surrounded on all sides, etc., to justify the actions they took. In fact, such an argument was made to justify Kronstadt's crushing.
Carrying out policies because you fear a certain kind of threat? Sure, I don't deny that that happens. But in this case, basically, Badmouse is claiming that everything they did was just an accident because they had bad information or they were scared or something, while I was claiming that it was basically an orchestrated plot. And obviously, when it comes to this one incident, it's impossible to prove, but I think it can be demonstrated that the mutiny was basically a plot, because there were so many other elements in it which were clearly orchestrated.
The Bolshevik commissar barely had time to object to the irregular proceedings before being cut off by the so-called military specialist in charge of artillery, former Tsarist general named Kozlovsky. "Your time is past," Kozlovsky declared.
It's true that they did speak over him. Once more, however, is conveniently left out the actions just the day prior by Kalinin and Kuzmin, who had been sent out to negotiate with the fleet, but in doing so, just ended up insulting and threatening the sailors.
My point wasn't that they spoke over the communists. My point was that Kozlovsky, who was a Tsarist general, as Badmouse himself states, used to be under the command of the Bolshevik commissar, but now all of a sudden this Tsarist general is running around and basically acting like he owns the place, saying, "Oh, your time has passed, we're taking over now." Well, who's we? Mensheviks, capitalists, Tsarist generals, a wannabe white guardist?
The Revolutionary Committee declares all communists present are to be seized and not to be released until the situation is clarified.
Finbal is here referencing a commonly referred to smoking gun article. A very important thing that the ICL leave out of their report is that one of the main white agents, George Elfengren, whose document they cite, by the way, admitted after the revolt that despite there being organizations in and around Petrograd that were wanting to usurp the Bolsheviks, that the events that took place in Petrograd and Kronstadt were not the actions of the above-mentioned organizations and occurred spontaneously against their will.
So about the uprising, we basically have two White Guard documents available. One of them is called the White Guard Memorandum on the Question of Organizing an Uprising in Kronstadt, and it says the following, quote, "Information emanating from Kronstadt compels one to believe that during the coming spring an uprising will erupt in Kronstadt. If its preparation receives some outside support, one may count entirely on the success of the rising, towards which the following circumstances will be favorable. The only conceivable military resistance to the uprising immediately after it has begun would be for the Bolsheviks to open fire on Kronstadt from the batteries of Krasnaya Gorka, the fort situated on the mainland on the southern coast of the Finnish Gulf, but the artillery of Krasnaya Gorka is completely powerless before the artillery of the ships and batteries of Kronstadt, yada yada." Then it just goes on to say that Kronstadt has better artillery, better range, whatnot, so that they feel that the uprising would be successful. Then the document goes on. "From the above, it is clear that exceptionally favorable circumstances exist for the success of a Kronstadt uprising. 1. The presence of a closely knit group of energetic organizers for the rising. 2. Corresponding inclination towards rebellion amongst the sailors. 3. The small area of preparations delimited by Kronstadt's narrow contours, which will ensure the total success of the uprising. And 4. The possibility of preparing the rising in full secrecy, which is afforded by Kronstadt's isolation from Russia and by the homogeneity and solidarity among the sailors. In view of the above, the military situation in Kronstadt following the uprising may be regarded as completely secure, and the base will be able to hold out as long as it has to. However, the internal living conditions after the rebellion may prove fatal for Kronstadt. There is enough food to last only for a few days after the uprising. If Kronstadt is not supplied immediately after the overturn, and if the future supply of Kronstadt is not properly assured, then the inevitable hunger will force Kronstadt to fall under the authority of the Bolsheviks. Russian anti-Bolshevik organizations are not strong enough to solve this food problem and are compelled to turn for aid to the French government." I've slightly shortened the text, but it's just more information about the food issue and also the fact that they're worried that the morale of the rebels could become a problem. The memorandum goes on. "Furthermore, if one assumes that military operations will be launched from Kronstadt to overthrow Soviet authority in Russia, then for this purpose also the dispatch to Kronstadt of General Wrangel's Russian armed forces would be needed. In connection with this, it is appropriate to mention that for such operations, or merely for the threat of such operations, Kronstadt can serve as an invulnerable base. The nearest object of action from Kronstadt would be the defenseless Petrograd, whose conquest would mean that half the battle against the Bolsheviks shall have been won," unquote. So in other words, this White Guard document, it says that they have an organization in place, they think an uprising is imminent, they think they have all the necessary requirements for the uprising, they just need to get the foreign powers to support them and make some practical preparations, and then they should be pretty much good to go. They think that a landing in Kronstadt by the French and by Wrangel could make it possible to even conquer Petrograd and defeat Bolshevism altogether. Or at least in such a project, Kronstadt could serve as an invulnerable base. So it pretty much confirms everything that the Bolsheviks were suspecting or were worried about. However, things did not go exactly as the Whites planned, as we can see from the other White Guard document, which is the report to the Russian Evacuation Committee in Poland by Yrjö Elvengren, or Georg Elvengren as he is known internationally. And in this document, Elvengren says a lot of things, but the thing that really interests us is where he says, quote, "The events that took place in Petrograd and Kronstadt were not the actions of the aforementioned organization and spontaneously occurred against their wishes, or rather, to put it more precisely, their outbreak went against their wishes because at that time the Bolsheviks sensed that there would soon be an organized uprising." So what he's saying is that the White Guard organization was in place in Kronstadt and was preparing an uprising at this exact time, but they had their own timetable. They were waiting for an opportune moment. However, the uprising broke out prematurely before they had wanted it to. That's why he says it broke out against their wishes. He doesn't mean that they didn't support it. He just means that they thought the timing was off. And he also says that it wasn't fully in their control because they weren't the ones that started it. They were trying to start it, but it was sparked off prematurely. However, when the uprising broke out, the Whites nonetheless did everything they could to support it. And, they had this whole plan in place, like, okay, we're gonna start the uprising, then we're gonna do this, this, and this. And they still did all those other things. The only thing they thought was wrong was the timing, but they still had the whole plan in place, so they went ahead with it. Now, is this Elvengren document legitimate or accurate? Well, I don't know, but it could be. Obviously, when reading this, a person would ask, of course it's accurate, why would he be dishonest in a secret internal document? The only reason I can think of is he might be saying that it was launched against their wish because he wants to avoid responsibility for its failure. He says, well, everything would have worked out perfectly, but it's not that we screwed it up, it's just, some other people screwed it up. But it is also entirely possible that what he says is true. However, I would add that even though it's possible that the leaders of the mutiny, so Petrichenko and Kozlovsky and their immediate circle, weren't members of the White Guard organization in question, it was still pretty close. They were still both White Guards. Petrichenko had wanted to join the Whites, and later he did, and Kozlovsky was a Tsarist general who the Whites seemed to respect, and also Baron Wilken was their contact to the White Guard organization. So, if they originally weren't members of the White Guard organization, they soon joined the Whites anyway. People sometimes think that the White Guards were only monarchists, but that's not really true. The leadership of the Kronstadt mutiny, besides these aforementioned White Guards, it also included Mensheviks and cadets, and both the right-wing Mensheviks and the cadets were members of various White Guard organizations and were members of various White Guard governments during the Civil War. And the same goes for the right SRs as well. And I think I originally said that the SRs had a lot of influence in the leadership of the mutiny, because some sources either stated or speculated that Petrichenko and a lot of the other members in the leadership whose party affiliation was not listed, that they were either members or probably just supporters of the SR party.
I am willing to admit that the Presidium acted in an opportunistic manner in this scenario with the arrest of the communists. But as we've gone over, there was ample reason to believe this. And for the record, the Bolsheviks themselves have been none too privy to using surrounding events to push forward control of the Soviets.
I think you kind of have to look at those things on a case-by-case basis, but also it really depends on who is doing what. Let's say that the Bolsheviks pass the decision to approve the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk against the will of the left-wing SRs, or perhaps they create the committees of the rural poor against the will of the left SRs. Regardless of what kind of tactics they use to get that decision passed, there's a difference between the class forces behind those moves. Because something like the Poor Peasant Committees, they are proletarian organizations. That's not really the case with the Kronstadt mutiny. Like, the whole movement was incredibly tainted since the very beginning. Since the very beginning, it receives the sympathies and support of the capitalists, both domestic and abroad. Ever since the beginning, the Mensheviks and members of capitalist parties join it. You can say that the White Guard was not involved in actually planning it. And even if we assume that the leader of the mutiny did not want to join the Whites originally, they still joined the Whites in the end. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So it's not simply about like, okay, you push this decision through and we push this decision through. No, it's, are you supporting the Reds or are you supporting the Whites?
Petrichenko claimed that the Provisional Committee was elected by soldier delegates. However, this was simply a lie. No election of such a kind had ever taken place. But the masses didn't know that. After all, maybe their delegates in their meeting had elected such a committee. Who could say?
I find Finn's use of words here a little bit strange. They seem to be in the realm of speculation to create doubt. But once more, Finn decides to forget about the fact that the committee was elected. Of the initial 5, The conference of 303 elected delegates promptly elected a 5-man presidium. This presidium took duties for the next 2 days due to the panic, but it didn't just stay like that, as is being inferred from Finn's omissions.
That's not really true. The original leadership of the mutiny was the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, which was not elected, and Avrich says it is due to lack of time. This is the leadership that kept control of the mutiny consistently from beginning to end. This is the leadership that launched the rebellion. This is the leadership that ordered the communists to be arrested. And after doing that, they basically told the population that the city is now at war with the Bolsheviks. This leadership had basically just appointed itself into this position, but it later claimed to have been elected and even enlarged. Whether this after-the-fact election actually took place at some delegate meeting, it's hard to say, but the mutiny leadership claims that it did. The only source for it is their proclamation that it did. However, let's assume that it eventually did take place, but that was only after this unelected leadership had already launched the uprising, had already arrested all the communists and all the opposition, and outlawed them, and after the population had been told that the communists are trying to kill them, so nobody should support them, and if anybody still wants to support them, well, they'll just be arrested with the rest of the communists. Katkov also says that the mutiny was announced in a declaration already 1 day before the meeting where this 5-man presidium announced it, which means that the real leadership of the mutiny must have been created already secretly before it was ever even discussed, let alone elected. And Katkov also doesn't mention anything about elections having taken place on March 4th, but on March 2nd there may have been some delegate meetings, or at least there was contradictory information. Some people saying that the meeting is taking place in one place, while other people were saying that the meeting is taking place at a different location, so that there were different groups of people waiting around, confused about where this meeting is supposed to be happening.
Now, Finn moves on to the makeup of the committee.
2 members of this committee were Mensheviks, who had opposed the October Revolution. Mensheviks and their foreign supporters believed that Russia needed capitalism and that Russia wasn't ready for a workers' revolution. Therefore, the workers' revolution needs to be defeated and capitalism needs to be restored. Ivan Oreshin, another member in the committee, was part of the capitalist Cadet Party, one of the leading parties under the Tsar.
Firstly, as you'll know, the Mensheviks were not a monolith, and within them contained numerous different allegiances and strategy.
I don't actually think that's true, especially in this case. What are the different sections of the Mensheviks? The right-wing Mensheviks openly and explicitly collaborate with the White Guard in the Civil War, while the left Mensheviks, they criticize the Bolsheviks, they try to hinder the Red Army's war effort, they say that the Red Army should not wage the war, that the war should be brought to an end, that there should be brotherhood and unity between the Reds and the Whites, and also they basically defend the right-wing Mensheviks. Sure, in words they say, we don't agree with this White Guard violence against the Reds, and they even say to the right-wing Mensheviks, if you don't stop, we'll expel you from the party or something, but they never actually expel them. So basically you have 2 kinds of anti-Bolshevik Menshevism. One is explicitly violent, the other is either non-violent or at least the violence is secret, and they exist in the same party, and there is no such a hard split between them. However, by the time of the Kronstadt mutiny, I think even those differences have basically withered to nothing. Because it doesn't matter if you're a left-wing Menshevik or a right-wing Menshevik. If you support the Kronstadt mutiny, it means that you support a violent uprising against the Bolshevik government. You are basically a right-wing Menshevik at that point. Because the only difference was, do you support open violence or not?
Secondly, the Russian Revolution was a time of enormous political enlightenment and fluidity. It was very common for someone to move around a lot between parties and allegiances. So just saying that they used to do this or they used to do that isn't wholly damning of someone's political intentions. Trotsky, for example, was a former Menshevik, and I know you love him.
Yeah, it's entirely true that somebody could change their mind. That's why I don't hold it against Kollontai that she used to be a Menshevik. I don't hold it against Maisky that he used to be a Menshevik. But when Maisky was heading one of the anti-Bolshevik forces, I would have said that it's counter-revolutionary, and he himself also said that. Later, when he changed his mind and decided to stop doing that. This is not about something that they did in the past. If we're talking about what they were doing in the mutiny, well, they are waging a violent uprising. What they did in the past or what they're doing in the future, we're not talking about that.
The article only mentions 3 members. This still leaves 12 members, the majority.
It's not true that I only mentioned 3. I mentioned that 2 of them were Mensheviks. Oreshin was a cadet, a supporter of capitalism. Their leader, Petrichenko, claimed to be a syndicalist, but he also apparently had tried to join the Whites. He was probably not a member of any party, but he was a White Guard sympathizer. The chief editor of the rebel newspaper was also a cadet. Other members of the leadership of the rebellion that are mentioned are Vershinin, who was a black marketeer, probably not a member of any party, but basically an illegal capitalist. Pavlov, a Tsarist policeman, probably not a member of any party since it's not mentioned. Two capitalists, Baikov and Tukin, again probably not members of any parties. Kilgast, a government official who had been convicted of embezzling government funds. Then there's Perepelkin, who was an actual anarchist. Now, if my count is correct, that's 11, so I think I missed one, but that's 11 out of 12. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the 12th guy was a, left SR, right SR, even a Bolshevik. Would that really significantly change things? Half of them are capitalists, the other half are members of right-wing parties or Mensheviks. And actually, when I was reading Getzler, I noticed that he says there were actually 4 Mensheviks in the PRC and not only 2. And he also says that the rebel newspaper was run by a Menshevik, a left SR maximalist, and by a priest who was also right SR. And I think in another source, the priest was described as a cadet supporter, and even though it doesn't really matter, I think that is probably because after the February Revolution, a lot of cadets or people who supported the cadets joined the right SRs instead. These new right SR members were considered complete fake socialists and were considered basically just liberals, much more right-wing than even the original right SRs, and they were called March socialists. Or February socialists, because they started calling themselves right SRs after the February Revolution, or March Revolution in the Russian calendar of the time.
The makeup of the revolt was mixed. Largely speaking, it was, as I've heard being referred to, as politically pluralist.
Legitimately ask yourself now, what does politically pluralist mean in this context? What possible parties or views could they hold? They might be Mensheviks, in which case they oppose socialism. No matter what kind of Menshevik they are, it means they oppose socialism. They think that Russia is not ready for socialism. They want to restore capitalism. They might be SRs. Well, if they're a right-wing SR, they want to restore capitalism. If they're a left-wing SR, they might defend some kind of idea of socialism. But the thing is that the left and right-wing SRs had obviously originally split, but by this point they had merged again. I know it's very convoluted, but that's actually the case. They had originally split because the left supported the revolution and the rights didn't, and the lefts wanted to collaborate with the Bolsheviks and the rights didn't. But once the left SRs also turned against the Bolsheviks, mainly due to their disagreements regarding the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, but also other things, they realized that they don't really have any relevant disagreements with the right SRs anymore. The right SRs obviously wanted to continue Russia's involvement in World War I, back when World War I was still actually going on. The lefts didn't agree, but since the left SRs also opposed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty just like the right SRs did, they also kinda in a weird way ended up supporting war against Germany, hence they kinda go back into the position of supporting the World War again, so basically they've merged again. This means that the possible parties that these guys could be is Mensheviks who are in favor of capitalism, is SRs who are in favor of capitalism, or they could be cadets, the most capitalist party out of all of them, unless they happen to be a member of some SR splinter group, but they're all pretty much the same. Or they could be a member of a cadet splinter group, but they're all the same as cadets except usually even more right-wing. And then possibly they could be anarchist. There were basically 2 kinds of anarchists in Russia at the time. In reality, there were many different kinds, but for the sake of this, there's basically 2 trends. There's those who want to work with the Bolsheviks, and then there's those who don't. And these guys are obviously the ones that don't. They probably would argue that they want some kind of stateless society in the long term, and some kind of socialism in the long term. But in the short term, apparently they were willing to accept even collaboration with the whites and the slogan for military dictatorship, as Badmouse says at the end of the video. So I don't really see how pluralist it is. I think the whole concept of political pluralism is kind of flawed. I think it's a capitalist concept. You're either in favor of socialism or you're not. And of course there's some gray area between them. There's some people who are kind of leaning towards capitalism or leaning towards socialism. Some people who are not communists but they work with the communists or support communists, or they might be like utopian socialists or reformist socialists who still work with revolutionary socialists, or they support socialism to an extent. But basically, the situation tends to become polarized where you have to pick a side. And in this case, it's either Soviet socialism or no socialism at all. The Kronstadt rebels also understood that, which is why they allied themselves to forces which were against socialism.
Just for comparison, I thought it might be quite funny to have a look at some of the reports on how the Bolshevik elites themselves were living during this period of severe hardship. 5,000 Bolsheviks and their families lived in the Kremlin and in special party hotels such as the National and the Metropole in the center of Moscow. The Kremlin's domestic quarters had over 2,000 service staff and its own complex of shops.
Maybe in theory, and I don't deny that there were some corrupt individuals at various points. Like, it was said that Zinoviev was one of the more corrupt ones, but still, according to Victor Serge, Zinoviev's brother-in-law died of starvation. And the example of Zinoviev's incredible luxury given by Badmouse is just that Zinoviev's caretaker was looking for vinegar for him. I'm sure vinegar was scarce, but it's hardly like an extreme item of luxury. And we don't even know if Zinoviev demanded vinegar. Maybe the employee was just trying to go above and beyond. Udovicki-Selb writes in his book that Stalin, quote, had an ascetic style, slept only a few hours a night on a narrow camp bed set by his desk, unquote. While Figes writes about Lenin that, quote, even as the leader of the Soviet state, Lenin lived the Spartan lifestyle of the revolutionary underground. Until March 1918, he and Krupskaya occupied a barely furnished room in the Smolny Institute, a former girls' boarding school, sleeping on 2 narrow camp beds and washing themselves with cold water from a bowl. It was more like a prison cell than the suite of the dictator of the biggest country in the world. When the government moved to Moscow, they lived with Lenin's sister in a modest 3-room apartment within the Kremlin and took their meals in the cafeteria, unquote. And then Victor Serge himself, who is one of Badmouse's sources, also has this to say. And by the way, since Badmouse points out that sometimes I didn't include something that Avrich said, I mean, why doesn't he include this, since Serge is one of the people he cites? This is what Serge says, quote, every day at the table reserved for the Northern Commune executive, we found greasy soup and often a ration of slightly high but still delicious horse meat. I think high means that it's gone bad, that it's rotten. The customary diners were there: Zinoviev, Yevdokimov from the Central Committee, Zorin from the Petrograd Committee, Bakayev, president of the Cheka, sometimes Helena Stasova, secretary of the Central Committee, sometimes Stalin, who was practically unknown. You know, that's typical Serge dissing Stalin. Zinoviev occupied an apartment on the first floor of the Astoria Hotel. As an extraordinary privilege, this hotel of dictators was kept almost warm and was lit brightly at nightfall since work there never stopped. Rumors endowed us with incredible comfort. All this time, Bakayev of the Cheka was going around with holes in his boots. In spite of my special rations as a government official, I would have died of hunger without the sordid manipulations of the black market, where we traded the petty possessions we had brought from France. The eldest son of my friend Ionov, Zinoviev's brother-in-law, an executive member of the Soviet and founder and director of the State Library, died of hunger before our very eyes. All this while we were looking after considerable stocks and even riches, but on the state's behalf and under rigorous control. So the special cafeterias and the luxury of the Astoria Hotel, the luxury of it is very relative. I'll also include a brief clip from a different video of mine. If the people suffered from shortages of food, so did the communists. Conditions during 1918 up to the 1920s were so hard, even for the Bolshevik rulers, that they mostly, with the exception of maybe some corrupt individuals, lived in cold, damp and dark rooms, slept and ate little, as Kollontai says in her memoirs. Kollontai actually says in her memoirs that she felt a lot of nostalgia for her émigré days before the revolution, because the conditions were so bad. Visitors also said that Foreign Affairs Commissar Chicherin looked like he was starving to death. President of the Republic, Sverdlov, and the leader of the Bolshevik women's section, Armand, both died of preventable disease during the Civil War, as also did the famous communist activist John Reed. The book The Bullet Mission to Russia, which was prepared by American diplomats, writes the following, quote, everyone is hungry in Moscow and Petrograd, including the people's commissaries themselves. The daily ration of Lenin and the other commissaries is the same as that of a soldier in the army or a workman at hard labor. In the hotel, which is reserved for government officials, the menu is the following: breakfast, a quarter to half a pound of black bread, which must last all day, and tea without sugar. Dinner, a good soup, a small piece of fish, for which occasionally a diminutive piece of meat is substituted, a vegetable, either a potato or a bit of cabbage, more tea without sugar. Supper, what remains of the morning ration of bread, and more tea without sugar, unquote. H.G. Wells writes that, quote, "The general spirit of Bolshevism is quite honest, and it is set very stoutly against looting and such like," unquote. And whatever else we may say to the discredit of the Bolshevik leaders, it is undeniable that the great majority lead not simply laborious but puritanical lives, unquote. McBride writes, quote, "In all the villages I visited, I found the peasants faring much better than were the commissars in Moscow," unquote. And why is that? Well, in the villages, there's firewood, and there's also food.
So already from its very inception, the Kronstadt mutiny was basically counter-revolutionary.
You need to stop using the term counter-revolutionary so much. It is a very relative term. What you're basically saying is they're opposing us.
In a way, of course, anybody can claim that anybody is counter-revolutionary, but what I meant in this case was very specific. In my opinion, if anarchists had overthrown the Bolsheviks, in my opinion, the anarchists would not have built socialism. It would have resulted in the restoration of capitalism. So in that sense, such an action would have been counter-revolutionary. However, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that the leadership of the mutiny had Mensheviks and cadets and capitalists in it, and they collaborated with the White Guards. So if they carry out this rebellion, and if they were to succeed, how could it result in anything other than counter-revolution? It's just not feasible to me how these kinds of forces could overthrow the Bolsheviks and simply not restore the bourgeois regime in one form or another. And some of them even said that that's what they wanted to do. My opinion is that the leaders of the rebellion were advocating that in a veiled form all along, because they were using the same slogans as the Mensheviks and cadets, who were saying Soviets without parties, or Soviets without Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks and SRs and cadets, they had been talking about those kinds of things for a while throughout the Civil War, saying that we will allow the Soviets temporarily and then that's going to be our way of transitioning to a dictatorship of capital. And as Badmouse says at the end of this video, the leaders of the Kronstadt mutiny, they eventually accept the White Guard demand for a temporary military dictatorship. The White Guards basically wanted to create like a Kornilov or Kolchak type dictatorship, and I don't think it was meant to be temporary at all. But nonetheless, I just don't see how any kind of socialism or any kind of revolution could result from such ingredients. And Badmouse even says throughout the video that he condemns the leadership of the Kronstadt mutiny and whatnot, so I'm using the term counter-revolutionary in a very specific way. I'm using it to literally mean restoration of capitalism.
The mutiny leaders needed to gauge the mood of the soldiers and try to fool them. Leader of the mutiny, would-be White Guardist Petrichenko, made the proposal to allow full freedom for quote-unquote all socialist parties in the public meeting of March 1st. Immediately he was attacked by angry shouts by soldiers, quote, "That's freedom for the right SRs and Mensheviks. No, no way." The cadet Ivan Oreshin, who was also part of the PRC, wrote, quote, "The Kronstadt uprising broke out under the pretext of replacing the old Soviet with a new one. The question of extending the vote also to the bourgeoisie was carefully avoided by the orators. They did not want to evoke opposition among the insurgents."
What Petrichenko is doing here is simply listing proposals for the resolution.
He may simply be listing the various proposals, but the point being made here is that the leadership of the uprising was putting forward these ideas like, we should allow the Mensheviks, we should allow the SRs, and they faced opposition to that. They were kind of testing the waters, and they realized that they shouldn't talk about restoring the rights of the capitalists, that they shouldn't really talk about constituent assembly. Instead, they should talk about something like Soviets without parties, which is what they actually did.
It was still completely obvious that the Kronstadt mutineers were not following anarchist theory in any typical sense. They were not establishing a stateless society, but an anti-communist military dictatorship.
What is failed to be referenced at this point is that the military dictatorship line comes from after the revolt had failed, by some of those who survived.
It's true that after the uprising had failed, they started openly talking about their idea for military dictatorship, but they had basically set up a military dictatorship during the uprising already. The whole movement was just led by a bunch of generals, and the Bolshevik Party was banned. And the only parties that were allowed were either explicitly capitalist or de facto capitalist.
Just for the record, I really want to hammer home just how unlikely a white resurgence was.
Sure, but if this had been used to sponsor a new invasion by an imperialist power such as the French or the British, then that could have changed things. At least it could have posed a serious danger. Now, of course, it's a long shot, and yeah, it was probably never gonna work, but the same goes for the whole mutiny in general. And think about how the Civil War started to begin with. The Whites were never a particularly strong force to begin with. After the October Revolution, there was the Moscow uprising of white officers that was defeated within 24 hours. There was Kerensky's uprising, which collapsed without firing a single shot. There was the Yaroslav uprising, led by Savinkov's white officer organization, which was the most significant out of all the White Guard uprisings, and it collaborated with tons of different organizations, and it also received help from foreign powers, but it still collapsed pretty quickly because the foreign powers who were supposed to invade didn't get there in time. And then there was the uprising of the Czechoslovak Legion, which ended up causing more problems for the Bolsheviks, but even that probably wouldn't have been all that significant if it wasn't for the fact that the British invaded, and the Americans invaded, and the French invaded, and the Japanese invaded, and the Germans too. And then it became pretty serious for the Bolsheviks for a number of years, and that's really how the Civil War started. The Whites didn't really have anything going for them until the foreign powers invaded. So now, the Bolsheviks have just defeated all the white armies, and now you still have Wrangel and those kinds of people who say they wanna invade again. They wanna perhaps invade from Finland, perhaps from the Baltics. Now they're saying that they wanna make a landing in Kronstadt. Well, how did the Civil War begin? Well, the British landed in Arkhangelsk. That's very close to Kronstadt. The French and British and Japanese and Americans, they land in Vladivostok. That's obviously far away, but still, it started in the form of these landings. Even though it is a long shot, at least now in hindsight, the idea that they could just try to do that again and make another landing and send more invasion troops, it's not unfeasible, and yeah, Badmouse says that, well, only absolute diehards would think that. Perhaps. But those diehards existed, people like General Wrangel and all the Russian capitalists who were willing to give it political leadership and also give that project money. And after the Kronstadt uprising fails, the leaders of that uprising, they go and team up with Wrangel.
The Whites, by comparison, were decimated. At this point, Finland had declared peace. No imperial power had the will or determination to engage.
And also that idea that Finland had declared peace, yeah, that's true, but that still didn't stop Finland from sponsoring another invasion 2 years later. Those kinds of things are a bit unpredictable. How can you know what's gonna happen? I strongly disagree that the only threat was of an internal matter. Besides, the Japanese hadn't even left at that point. They only left in 1925.
We're seeing a lot of references in these works about Kronstadt regarding communists. It is most probable from the way in which they are referring to them that this is simply being used as a replacement for Bolshevik. So this is to say that denouncing communists might not have been an indictment of all socialist ideas.
I mean, yeah, perhaps not to denounce all socialist ideas, but what other party was really advocating for socialism at that time? Like, the Mensheviks? No. The SRs? No. Cadets? No. Are you talking about some anarchist group?
Quote, early on the morning of March 18th, Shustov set up a machine gun outside the cell, which contained 23 prisoners. He was prevented from slaughtering the communists only by the advance of the Red Army across the ice.
This Shustov account is coming solely from the words of Kuzmin, and according to Victor Serge, the anarchist who turned Bolshevik and then eventually got purged, the press definitely did their fair bit of embellishing. Now let's compare that with the actions of the Bolsheviks when the revolt started. After the first wave of revolts, the authorities responded by taking hostages and warning that any harm to the communists would have grave consequences.
It's kind of weird. This argument basically boils down to, I pointed out that the anarchists had this plan to commit a mass killing of the Bolsheviks, and I pointed that out just because anarchists always say that the Bolsheviks are so violent, and then Badmouse responds to that by saying, well, yeah, but the Bolsheviks are violent too. So we've kind of gone in a circle.
But all of this pearl-clutching is very rich, coming from Finnish Bolshevik, seeing as the man is a very visible enjoyer of Grover fur, having made a 34-video playlist on him, which leads me to the conclusion that he probably supports or denies the Katyn massacre.
And how is the Katyn massacre relevant to this? I mean, he says that I'm being sneaky and dishonest, but I think he's kind of intentionally doing some kind of equivocation here, because he says that I'm defending the Katyn killing, or I'm denying it. Well, yeah, if I was defending mass killings, then maybe you would have some kind of point, but he knows that that's not the case, So he says, or he denies it. Because yeah, the communist position is usually that they don't think that the communists committed the Katyn killings. Communists tend to think that the Nazis committed those killings.
Pinball claims that they wanted to allow anti-Bolshevik parties. I mean, yes, that's an ideological game.
It's not an ideological game. I listed it like that because isn't that what they wanted to do? I don't understand how you can disagree with that. They wanted to allow the parties that were against the communists while they themselves were suppressing the Communist Party. Isn't that exactly what they wanted to do? They say that they want to free political prisoners, by which they mean, well, obviously, they want to free anti-communists, anti-Bolsheviks. I call them vague because their demands are in the abstract. It says, free political prisoners. Well, yeah, but what does that mean in practice? What does that mean concretely? Well, it means that the Bolsheviks will be imprisoned, of course, but the anti-Bolsheviks will be freed.
Why does Finball list this one as more rations for us? The demands, as he then states, wanted to equalize the rations, not give more.
They wanted bigger rations for themselves. They were saying, other people have rations larger than us. We want bigger rations. We want the same rations for all, which means bigger rations for us and a decrease in rations for other people. The fact that it says like bigger rations for them, same rations for all, yeah, I realize that it's written in a pretty dumb way now that I'm looking at it, but it just means they wanted theirs to be increased and that of other people to be decreased. And my point was that these demands, they're all demagogic or concretely counter-revolutionary. They're formulated in a way where it's just demanding freedom in the abstract, but hidden behind that is actually freedom for anti-communism and really nothing else. And it's also saying, give us bigger rations. Well, that's an easy way to get popularity, is just promise people bigger rations. And then all the other slogans, like no political commissars and whatnot, again, that is masquerading behind this facade of, oh, we just want freedom. No, what does it actually mean? It means there's all these white generals or these czarist generals, and the political commissars used to control them. Get rid of the political commissar, and now the czarist officers are not controlled by anyone. They're running rampant. Somebody might support that genuinely, thinking that they just don't like commissars, they want quote-unquote freedom, but they just don't understand what they're doing. They don't understand that they're just liberating the czarist officers. And I think the whole demand was invented because of that reason. They invented this demand of no political commissars so that they could give the czarist officers freedom of action. There's only two options. Either this slogan was specifically designed so that they could liberate the czarist officers and give them freedom of action, or they're doing that by accident out of stupidity. But I don't think they're that stupid. Not all of them. Not the leadership, at least.
He defends this unequal distribution of rations by the Bolsheviks by stating that they had to give bigger rations to the ex-bourgeoisie and party members because if not, they would defect. These sorts of justifications are the reason why it's very hard to engage with ML defenses because they always invite larger ideological questions.
That's an interesting point, and yeah, I'm willing to entertain the thought that maybe it was a mistake, or maybe they went too far or something, but I think at the time it really did seem necessary, and they didn't only use that tactic, by the way. They basically had three options. It's either we don't get any experts at all. Well, that's one way to go, but that's probably going to result in a disaster. Then there's option 2, which is coerce the experts, which is what they also did. That's what the commissars are doing. They coerce the czarist officers. Or 3, bribe the experts. And they also did that. Now, on top of that, you could also try to appeal to the reason, morality, patriotism, civic honor, what have you, of the bourgeois experts. Sure, you can do that and you should do that, but that's not going to be enough.
Former imperial officers were used as military specialists under the watchful supervision of political commissars. In this way, badly needed command experience and technical knowledge were provided until a new corps of Red commanders could be trained. The Kronstadt mutineers demanded that this system be abolished. One can only imagine what the results would have been. The non-communist officers inside the Red Army would no longer follow socialist instructions, and the Red Army would basically stop being a proletarian army at all.
Once more, Finball ignores the reasoning behind getting rid of the commissars. They wanted these to be elected by the sailors, instead of instructed head down from the party. Perhaps they had their own personal annoyances with the commissars, which have been going on for years. So clearly, very different from the pearl clutch of, they wanted to abolish commissars. This means that the white officers would have immediately been freed.
Yeah, but isn't that what happened though? It's actually pretty clever what they did. They say, yeah, we abolish the commissars and then if it's necessary then we'll just elect new ones. Well, did they? No, they just got rid of them. They got rid of them, and the white officers were running free, and that's the end of the story.
Why is Finbal repeatedly referring to Kozlovsky as a white general? Kozlovsky was a Tsarist general, who then defected to the Bolsheviks and was appointed by Trotsky to serve in the Red Army.
Okay, so Badmouse is saying he wasn't a white general, he was a Tsarist general. Well, what's the difference? What actually is the difference? There is no difference. Like, you can be a Tsarist general, in other words, a white general, or you can be an ex-Tsarist general. But if you are a Tsarist general, you are a white general. And then Badmouse says, well, he was recruited by the Bolsheviks because they used Tsarist officers under the watch of the commissars. They basically coerced them to join the Red Army. Some of them, of course, came willingly and became communists, but a lot of them were also coerced into it. So Kozlovsky is recruited into the Red Army, and then he organizes an anti-communist mutiny. So how does that result in him not being a white general? Isn't that what being a white general means?
Serge recounts in his diary that even prior to the full-blown revolt on March 2nd, the Bolsheviks were still pressing lies about Kozlovsky leading the revolt. What's terrible, then, is that Finn isn't just pulling this argument out of his arse, which would undoubtedly be better, because this is the exact thing which MLs are accused of but keep on denying, upholding an obvious party propaganda lie.
I don't know how this is a lie, though. Like, at most you could say that it's an exaggeration or misleading or something, but it says Kronstadt is in the hands of the whites. It's in the hands of an organization which is led by anti-Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, cadets, an old Tsarist general, and a bunch of capitalists. And then saying that Kozlovsky wasn't really the leader of the uprising, so saying that he was the leader of it is lies. The leadership structure of the uprising is perhaps not 100% clear, because obviously there was the people who actually carried out the uprising, then there was the leadership of the uprising, formed pretty much by the Provisional Committee, and then there was also Tsarist General Kozlovsky and Baron Wilken and other people like that, who were supposed to be some kind of military leaders of the uprising. And I said in my original video that Kozlovsky tried to convince the Mensheviks and SRs to begin a general offensive against the Soviet government, but the Mensheviks didn't want to do that. However, the Mensheviks later regretted that. They said that they didn't take the offensive and therefore the opportunity was let slip. And that's why Petrichenko wanted to basically carry out a coup inside the Provisional Committee itself to basically concentrate more power into his hands and into the hands of the white generals. So to say that they are led by a white general, it's not really untrue. The only thing you could say against that is, as an asterisk, that they also had Petrichenko, by the way, also a wannabe white guardist, and later an actual white guardist, and his immediate circle. And Badmouse is saying that Kozlovsky was not really a white general, he was just a Tsarist general, which is already a pretty interesting statement, but the Kronstadt Provisional Committee felt the need to claim that Kozlovsky was not there, or that Kozlovsky didn't exist, because they knew that he was a white general, so they wanted to deny it. That's why they say, quote, "In Kronstadt, total power is in the hands only of the revolutionary sailors, not of the White Guards headed by some General Kozlovsky, as the slanderous Moscow radio proclaims. We have only one general here, Commissar of the Baltic Fleet Kuzmin, and he has been arrested," unquote. So they want to deny the existence of Kozlovsky. But Kozlovsky, he was walking around like he owned the place. And that's also what the other sources say. That some people in the leadership found it unsettling that all these barons and Tsarist generals were in control of the situation, and that the place was being filled by a monarchist organization.
Serge goes on from this. Small posters stuck on the walls of the still empty streets proclaimed that the counter-revolutionary General Kozlovsky had seized Kronstadt through conspiracy and treason.
And also, you should ask yourself, why are you citing Serge exactly? What is this supposed to prove? So, the fact that he's saying this, that, oh, it was a lie, he's just an anarchist sympathizer who is against the Soviet government. His statements are not inherently reliable or accurate, in fact, quite the opposite. Is it really inaccurate to say that there had been a conspiracy and that General Kozlovsky was in power? No, it's not inaccurate. Is it inaccurate to say that Kozlovsky was committing treason? No. He was working for the government, now he's trying to overthrow the government. That's treason. Victor Serge says, no, that's all lies. In reality, there had been a mutiny of the sailors. Well, that's not entirely untrue. Those two things were basically part of the same phenomena. So the fact that he wants to portray it only as a socialist mutiny is just an example of his own bias.
Food and money also came from rich capitalists and white emigres to support the Kronstadt mutineers.
Finn lists hundreds and thousands of francs and large food supplies being sent to the fleet and states that Avrich confirms that they were delivered. He does not. Once more, he confirms that they intended to do this.
I think that's a valid correction, although it doesn't really change anything. Yes, it's true that Avrich confirms that those banks and those capitalists decided to send the money and the supplies to the rebels, but he doesn't say if the supplies reached their destination. Instead, I had other sources discussing how some of the supplies were delivered by the White Guards from Finland to Kronstadt, though probably most of the supplies didn't reach them because the uprising lasted only a short time.
It should go without saying that people offering money and supplies does not mean that the rebels themselves shared the same outlook as them.
Yeah, but I mean, are you sure that you read what I wrote or listened to what I said carefully enough? Because I specifically said that they secretly accepted these supplies, but in public they denied accepting them. So I'm not conflating anything. Quite the contrary, I am saying that there's a strong contrast between what the rank and file supporters of the uprising want, which is they don't want the supplies, and what the leadership of the uprising publicly says, which is they also say that they don't want the supplies, but then in reality, they secretly still agree to receive the supplies. So I'm not conflating those two, I'm saying that they are completely at odds. I'm saying that the leadership was consistently trying to deceive the supporters of the uprising. That's a running theme throughout the entire video.
Regardless of Avrich, from newer information we can ascertain a shipment may have been delivered, which was again made in desperation after the revolt failed to spread to the mainland.
So here Badmouse himself even agrees that the leadership of the uprising requested supplies from the whites. But he says it was just a last resort.
Pukhov writes, quote, "The PRC, seeing that Kronstadt was filling up with agents of a monarchist organization, issued a declaration that it would not enter into negotiations with, nor accept any aid from, any non-socialist parties. But Petrychenko and the general staff secretly worked in connection with the monarchists and prepared the ground for an overthrow of the committee." Unquote.
Scant is actually corroboratively known about Kupolov, apart from that he went out with Vashinin to negotiate with the Bolsheviks. I've been unable to verify this source in the archives, but if I had to give it charity, I would probably say that this does appear to be more so speculation on Kupolov's behalf.
For the sake of argument, let's say that it's just speculation, but the fact that a member of the Provisional Committee is saying that, in his opinion, the Provisional Committee is secretly accepting money and supplies from the White Guards and capitalists, I think that, with all the other stuff that was said, points towards that being the case.
Petrychenko appears to be talking in a more all-encompassing context of being generally isolated. Again, I don't think a single delivery of food and medicine on the 16th of March near the end of the fighting would really batter this statement.
Yeah, but don't you think that it's a little disingenuous when the capitalists have consistently been giving ideological and political support for the uprising? They've been collecting all this money and all these supplies, and they've been offering to send them, and then you secretly organize a meeting with their representative and you accept the supplies from them, and then the uprising still fails, so you escape, and then you decide to join the White Army of General Wrangel. Don't you think it's a little disingenuous to just dismiss that as, oh yeah, we just got one delivery of stuff one time? The mutineers were still acting in the interest of the capitalists because they were doing what they wanted them to do. When the capitalists support certain proxies somewhere, they don't necessarily care what the proxies think they're doing, they just want the proxies to do what they want them to do. And also, I just think it's significant when he says that we were not agents of Mensheviks or SRs, but they were also working with the Mensheviks and the SRs. And since in the video there's been so much discussion about deception and who is lying and who is telling the truth, and also about the white generals, I wanted to say something more about that, because for example, Volin quotes a statement from the Kronstadt mutineers, which says, quote, "There are neither generals nor white guards in the garrison," unquote, which is of course a lie. It's futile to claim that there were no generals. He quotes another statement that says, quote, "We have neither generals nor masters here. Kronstadt has always been a city of the workers and peasants, and it will continue to be so. The communists say that we are misled by spies. This is a barefaced lie," unquote. Again, they claim that there's no generals, even though there absolutely were generals, and he says that the communists say they're misled by spies. Well, Russian White Guards, together with the Finnish intelligence services, were in contact with the leaders of the mutiny, and they were the ones that delivered them the supplies. So again, it turns out that the communists are the ones telling the truth based on what they know, while the mutineers, at least in their media, are lying. According to Volin, the Bolsheviks wrote, quote, Oranienbaum, March 12th. Yesterday, men were seen sneaking over the ice from Kronstadt towards the Finnish coast. Likewise, men were seen coming from Finland towards Kronstadt. This proves that contact exists between Kronstadt and Finland, unquote. And Volin says that, according to the Kronstadt mutineers, this was a lie. But according to the facts, it turns out that they absolutely were in contact with White Guards in Finland. So again, the mutineers are lying, but the Bolsheviks are speaking the truth. Volin mocks what the Bolsheviks say. He writes, quote, always the same story. The social revolutionaries, directed by Paris, plot rebellion against the Soviet government, and as soon as their preparations are complete, the real master, a Tsarist general, makes his appearance. The story of Kolchak, who tried to regain power with the help of the social revolutionaries, is repeated again, unquote. So he's saying that this whole story is just absolutely ridiculous, and it's, oh yeah, always the same story, always the same untruths. But let's actually consider how White General Kolchak came to power. So he was one member, not in the political leadership, but in the military leadership of the Samara Menshevik SR government. This government fought the communists and repressed them, but eventually Kolchak took control of the whole government and turned it into a monarchist military dictatorship. Do you see a lot of the similarities? How there's this vaguely pseudo-socialist mutiny, but there's also a Tsarist general who is selected into the military leadership of the mutiny. And the Kolchak government received support from imperialists abroad. And the French ambassador Newlands also organized a conspiracy which united all the anti-Bolshevik parties, so right SRs, right Mensheviks, monarchists of various shades, cadets and other capitalists, and even the left SRs. So an equally quote-unquote pluralist movement. And the left SRs were recruited into this conspiracy to carry out terrorist attacks and also to launch an uprising. And the left SR general Muravyev turned his forces against the communists. And in that conspiracy, many of the parties didn't know that other parties were also involved in it, and they didn't know what the role of the other parties was. The French supplied the left SRs with weapons so that they could carry out terrorism, but the left SRs at the time didn't know that they were part of this broad alliance with the Whites and Mensheviks. They only learned that later. Now, is this not at all similar to the situation in Kronstadt, where these hapless rebels are basically being turned into tools of Wrangel within a matter of weeks? Is it really so ridiculous to point out that these kinds of things have happened many times already in the past? I mean, the rebels think, oh, we're just accepting some supplies from the Whites because it's an emergency. Well, the left SRs also thought, oh, we're just accepting some bombs and weapons from the French, but I'm sure it's not part of anything bigger. Here is a Bolshevik declaration that Volin gives. Quote, they lie to you that Petrograd is with you, that Siberia and the Ukraine support you. All these are only cynical lies. The last sailor in Petrograd turned his back on you when he learned that Tsarist generals like Kozlovsky were among you. Unquote. So that is what the Bolsheviks said. Is that untrue? No, it's true. Petrograd, Siberia, Ukraine didn't launch insurrections in support of Kronstadt. And it says that the workers don't support them because they've teamed up with Kozlovsky. This, of course, is more difficult to prove, but Katkov at least says that the workers didn't really support the mutiny, at least partially, because it was led by Whites. It says, quote, this provided the sailors at least a partial explanation for the disappointing inaction of the Petrograd proletariat, whom the Kronstadt sailors had been expecting confidently to join them in the rising, unquote. And then, this is another Bolshevik declaration that Volin quotes. Quote, naturally, all these generals, Kozlovsky and Borkser, all the wretches like Petruchenko and Tukin, will flee at the last moment to the White Guards in Finland, but you others, simple deceived sailors and red soldiers, where will you go? If they are promising to provide for you in Finland, they are fooling you again, unquote. Again, is this untrue? We all know that it's true. That's exactly what happened. Kozlovsky, Petruchenko, they fled to Finland, where the Finnish and Russian White Guards were greeting them.
Pereplenkin corroborates this, however, not particularly paid much attention to is that this is an interrogation by the Cheka. Not just here, but in 2 other statements by Finbal, he uses interrogation admissions as evidence towards the revolt being bad.
That is, of course, a valid point, so if that was all there was, then yeah, it wouldn't be credible enough. But considering that it matches with all the other evidence, I think it is credible enough, because it's only adding some details, like about the delivery of the supplies and the white generals being there. None of that's really new. The interrogation stuff doesn't really give us any completely new information. It's just some details on stuff we already know from other sources.
A victim of the Great Purge, Tukhachevsky, who, funnily enough, was also responsible for crushing the revolt, is notable for writing up a confession which is splattered in his own blood. Just a little funny side point, I have actually come across MLs who state, you can't prove that it's his blood.
I don't really know about that, but I have read an article which claims that the whole thing about Tukhachevsky's blood being on the document is a myth. I will link the article in the description. I have not studied the topic really, so I don't have expertise on it. But considering so many other things that people claim about the Soviet Union are myths, it wouldn't surprise me if this was as well.
However, at this point, the soldiers had basically had enough. They had begun to think that their leaders must be reactionaries. I mean, they had even seen the White Guard generals walking around, and they did not follow these orders. Instead, they rose up, they saved the ships, and arrested all the officers and Provisional Revolutionary Committee members they could get their hands on. So, you could say that there was a mutiny against the mutiny.
A mutiny against the mutiny is a bit of a stretch here. They said no, and then surrendered when they knew that it was hopeless.
Okay, let's ask ourselves, what is a mutiny? A mutiny is when soldiers no longer obey orders, and they may, in some cases, even arrest their leaders. What did the Kronstadt sailors do in this instance? Well, they refused to obey the orders of the leaders of the uprising, and they also arrested some of them, but many of them did manage to flee. I consider that a mutiny against the Kronstadt mutiny. Now, regarding some methodological points, Badmouse also takes this attitude that communists are just lying and that we should just, quote-unquote, accept what is the truth. He says that communists are just perpetuating some kind of party lie. He seems to think that we can just read capitalist or anarchist history books and maybe do some additional research, but basically do not challenge that starting point, do not challenge the capitalist narrative too much. He acts like the anarchist and capitalist writers are without an ideology, that they are only just accepting the simple truth. But what kind of truth is it? Their so-called truth basically just means that we shouldn't use too much class analysis and we should just try to deny all the communist claims as fantastical. If the communists say that something is bourgeois or somebody is a white guardist, then we should just consider it fantastical. For example, they think the claim of a white guard conspiracy in Kronstadt is fantastical, and supposedly it's more credible to just assume that there wasn't such an aspect to the mutiny. Serge's claim is a good example of that, because he says something along the lines of, the sailors mutinied, therefore it wasn't a white conspiracy. As if those two things are somehow so mutually exclusive. It seems like they only accept that it was a white conspiracy if the conspiracy is very blatantly and explicitly led only by monarchists, or if ordinary workers and peasants did not join in at all, or didn't play any kind of part in it. But in all revolutions, you've had regular people on both sides. The ruling classes could never stay in power if they didn't have regular people also supporting them or fighting in their ranks for one reason or another. There has never been such a pure white guard conspiracy. Even if you look at all the different white armies and white governments in the Civil War, it wasn't like that. The arguments that Badmouse makes are also good examples of it, because he says that Kozlovsky wasn't a white general, he was just a Tsarist general. Obviously, Kolchak was the leader of the entire white army at one point, but he was also just a Tsarist general working for the Menshevik and Right SR government in Samara. The Bolsheviks called them whites already back then, but then only later Kolchak set up an openly monarchist government. Does that mean that he wasn't a white guard before? Or does that mean that he wasn't a white guard at all? A white government isn't just a monarchist government. It just means a pro-capitalist government. And the Mensheviks and SRs, they didn't even consider themselves pro-capitalist because they just thought that they have to set up capitalism for the time being and then maybe at some very distant future they can have socialism, but they never even considered themselves pro-capitalist, but they still supported the whites. So you simply don't see these pure White Guard mutinies where it's just monarchists and nothing else. Badmouse's other argument is also a good example. He says that the mutineers probably didn't receive orders from abroad, and therefore they couldn't be pawns of the foreign capitalists. But if that's the case, if they weren't pawns of the foreign capitalists, then why did all the foreign capitalists support them then? The capitalists supported all anti-communist rebels, seeing them as viable ways of toppling socialism. That is also what happened in the Civil War. There were various parliamentary or even self-described socialist, Menshevik and otherwise, governments which fought against the Bolsheviks, but they all turned into open White Guard dictatorships and often even into monarchist governments during the Civil War, because the whites only used them, supported them, and eventually took them over. Of course, this doesn't remove the fact that the Kronstadt rebels really did have links to foreign capitalists. At the very least, the international White Guard leadership had its agents, of course, support the uprising. Monarchists and Mensheviks in Petrograd and elsewhere also spread the Kronstadt proclamations. The White Guards sent their agents from Finland to meet the Kronstadt rebels and negotiate with them, to which Badmouse says that the rebels accepted support from the whites only near the end. But that means that they accepted support from the whites within a week or two of launching their rebellion. The capitalists, anarchists and liberals and whatnot, their analysis says that we should just assume that what the mutineers say is true, and let's just assume that what the communists say is lies. That's their basic assumption, though it's of course never explicitly stated, and I think that they probably don't even realize they're doing it. It probably doesn't even occur to them, but still their whole narrative and the whole picture of what happened comes 90% from that. And the next step that they do is to just ignore all the stuff that they want to ignore. This means ignore the fact that the mutiny leadership was almost entirely anti-socialist, composed of Mensheviks, cadets, SRs, who were all against socialist construction, not simply during the October Revolution, not simply during the Civil War, but even in the foreseeable future. Then ignore all the ties to the monarchists, say that Kozlovsky is of no consequence, that the whites giving them support from Finland is of no consequence. Ignore the fact that the whole capitalist world is on their side. When you read statements from various anarchists who talk about this, it seems that they truly don't understand it. They say, ha, the whole capitalist world is on our side, supposedly. But that is what the capitalists said, though. And of course, capitalist historians are almost totally ignorant of the fact that the Kronstadt sailors in 1921 were not the same as those who participated in the October Revolution. It is totally beyond their comprehension, simply because they don't think in those terms. They don't accept the entire concept of class ideology or class composition of the army. They don't accept the entire concept of class consciousness. So the idea that the composition of the army was different, that the sailors were different people, and that even the working class had changed during the Civil War. And I'll give you an example. In Petrograd, majority of the workers in Petrograd left during the Civil War. The most conscious proletarians volunteered for the Red Army or the Red Guard, and then they were mobilized and sent to fight in the Civil War. Most of the communists were also mobilized. And during the Civil War, more and more of industrial workers were just mobilized and sent away to fight in the war. A lot of the poor people also escaped to the countryside because of a food shortage in the cities, and they turned back into peasants. So a lot of the people who stayed behind in the cities, a lot of them were older, more wealthy, Menshevik, white-collar workers and other kinds of workers, and also small business owners and sometimes even big business owners who had gone bankrupt and they needed to get a job so that they could survive, so they became workers. It's easy to understand how that kind of a proletariat is not the same proletariat as the one that existed previously, and it took some time for the situation to return to its original state.
After the Kronstadt mutiny failed and its leaders had fled to Finland, they made an agreement to join the White Army of Wrangel.
By all means, have a go at them for becoming reactionary. Fuck 'em. But I don't see how it's difficult to understand that when you've been disillusioned from a group that is presenting itself as the monopoly on progress, which enforces this might through strict discipline, then you try to reform it and you fail, and then that group sends bullets flying into your comrades, they get mowed down in front of you, you're losing all hope, you might possibly be of the mindset to regrettably accept the help of whoever was left. This is a highly likely reason why so many dissidents from the former socialist bloc ended up becoming supporters of capitalism, because the Soviets stamped out nearly all attempts at left alternatives. What else are you supposed to do?
I don't think it's a good argument to say, if you are being repressed, you should just join with the capitalists. I mean, Badmouse himself condemns it, he says it's wrong, so why are you then saying that they had no choice? Well, you have three options. Besides joining with the capitalists, you have, I would say, three options, assuming for the sake of argument that reform of any kind was impossible. Option one is you wage an ideologically correct but hopeless struggle and you die. Okay, that's option one. Probably a bad idea. Option two, you don't do anything. You just accept that we have a Soviet system which might not be the kind of socialism you want, or not the kind of society that you want, but I would imagine that they think it's better than capitalism. Or option three, you just try to organize some kind of socialist movement no matter what. That's basically what Marxists have always done, regardless of the situation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I personally don't think that it would have been correct to try to overthrow the Bolsheviks. But I think that teaming up with the capitalists is just, you're never going to achieve socialism by doing that. So if you're saying the other options don't work, well, this option doesn't work either. So it's pointless.
What this showcases is a flaw in the democratic centralist structure of the party, that it didn't allow for discontent to be channeled through it.
Predictably, I disagree, and also I think it's weird to say that these supposedly good rebels become complete reactionaries, but somehow it's the fault of the communists. I think it's weird to shift the blame like that. Look at it from the point of view of the Bolsheviks. Everybody who opposes them joins with the White Guards, so in their minds, they have every reason and justification to stop them. I mean, I guess if you tell them it's either Bolshevism or the White Guard, and then they choose the White Guard, how is that the fault of the Bolsheviks?
Even the Menshevik leader Dan admitted in his 1922 book that, quote, the Kronstadt mutiny was not supported by the Petersburg workers in any way, unquote. So he admits that basically nobody outside Kronstadt supported the mutiny except, reactionaries.
That's a lie. Once more, right after this passage about Pereblenkin, in which Finn spoke about earlier, anarchists across the country were highly supportive.
Sure, I don't really disagree with that. Fair enough. I know and believe that the anarchists supported it, but I was talking about the working class more broadly. The anarchists, they were obviously not the working class as a whole. They were not even one of the major parties or major political factions. They were a small political faction. I know that a lot of them supported the uprising, but I was just quoting what Dan was saying when Menshevik Dan was saying that basically in Petrograd or in the working class as a whole, you didn't notice any significant support for the uprisings.
In this section, Finball uses free sources to try and push the claim that the sailors wanted Soviets without communists. Let me make it very clear, this was never the slogan of the rebels. The actual slogan was, all power to the Soviets, not the parties.
I think that's probably false. I think the slogans are so similar that it could be a slight difference in translation, or it could just be a slight difference in general. If I was trying to be dishonest, what would be the point of changing it like that? I think it's completely meaningless. I don't care if you say Soviets without Bolsheviks, or Soviets without communists, or Soviets without the parties. It still means the same thing. It means get the communists out of there. And I've seen so many different versions of this in so many different books that I don't think it's all fake. I think you can probably trace it back to like the Civil War era when the SRs were spreading this idea that the Bolsheviks and the communists are two separate groups. They were sometimes saying that Lenin was actually an SR, or that Lenin was a Bolshevik and he was against the communists. Saying stuff like, long live the Soviets, down with the communists. That's already a very similar slogan, so I think it probably comes from there.
Anarchist historian Avrich writes that the bulk of the Kronstadt sailors currently present when the mutiny took place had actually fought in anti-communist forces before they got there.
I feel Finn is being intentionally deceptive here. There's two statements being made. Some of them had fought with the anti-Bolshevik forces, and the majority of the fleet had been switched up.
I think that's a fair correction, but I don't think Badmouse realizes that what is being said in this statement is that most of them were new people brought from Ukraine, and some of them had fought in the anti-Bolshevik armies. I think he ignores the first part, which says that most of them were new people, because that's really my main point. My main point was that these are not the same Kronstadt sailors as the ones who were involved in the October Revolution. These are new people.
Old-timers had been replaced by conscripts from the rural districts. By 1921, more than 3/4 of the sailors were of peasant origin, a substantially higher proportion than in 1917, when industrial workers from the Petrograd area made up a sizable part of the fleet.
And once more, Finnball ignores Avrich's very informative conclusions regarding the makeup of the fleet.
So in this quote that I provide, it says that obviously there had been a lot of turnover in the Baltic fleet during the Civil War, which basically means that the original sailors who carried out the October Revolution, well, they're gone now. And old-timers have been replaced by conscripts from the rural districts. And then it also says that by the time the mutiny took place, there were a lot more peasants and a lot less workers than originally, right? But then there's a different part much later in the book, and this is now Avrich's spin, because he is sympathetic to anarchism, he's sympathetic to the Kronstadt mutineers, so he tries to now debunk the Bolsheviks. So this is his own spin now. He's saying that doesn't necessarily mean that there was any real change in the fleet. He says that there had always been a lot of peasants. Well, yeah, sure, that's true, but he himself said that there was now a bigger percentage of peasants and a smaller percentage of workers. And then he says that there was little to distinguish the old-timers from the new recruits. Well, how come? There is a difference. I mean, the old-timers, they carried out the October Revolution, and the new recruits, they're completely new people, some of whom had fought in the anti-Bolshevik armies, and they carry out the Kronstadt uprising. There's quite a lot of difference between the two groups. However, in the opinion of Avrich, he says that both groups were basically similar because both were largely peasant background, and he says that both of them were against the government. Well, yeah, but which government though? The old-timers were against the Kerensky government, and the new conscripts were against the Soviet government. So just reducing it, oh yeah, they were just against the government, I think that is taking it to a level of abstraction where it turns into its opposite. And then he says that both groups had seen misery in their native districts. He says one while on furlough and the other before active duty. I don't think these claims are all that credible, and it just goes exactly the way you would imagine it going, which is that Avrich points out a bunch of facts. I use those to support my argument, but Badmouse doesn't accept it because he doesn't want to, and then he finds an opinion by Avrich which is not really factual, because the other part talks about very concrete facts and proportions of class forces, but then this other part is just equivocation and opinion and cope, basically, and then I don't accept that, but Badmouse does because he wants to. I'm willing to be somewhat critical of the sources that I use. I think he should also be. Are these arguments that Avrich makes here really all that solid? It's also missing the point, because what Avrich is saying is that there were different people, but they were just similar people. But that still means there were different people. Let's look at some more evidence about the social composition of the Kronstadt sailors. So Badmouse actually mentions that the sailors had had an earlier mutiny, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. But Katkov points out that, of course, the sailors had also repressed many mutinies themselves. So Katkov writes, quote, "Between 1918 and 1921, the Kronstadt sailors had been active on every front where Red armies were fighting. They had taken part in the suppression of many internal uprisings and mutinies," unquote. And basically, because originally the Kronstadt sailors were considered some of the best revolutionary fighters, that's why so many of them were sent to fight on the various fronts in the Civil War. And that's why eventually the composition of the Kronstadt base changed so drastically, because all the best class-conscious sailors were sent away. And this is what Volin, one of Badmouse's sources, writes, quote, "Kronstadt complied. Numerous formations departed for the depths of the country and carried out the tasks allotted, but nearly all these detachments were scattered in 1,000 directions. For various reasons, their members were forced to remain in the interior of the country and did not return to Kronstadt. Kronstadt was also constantly requested to send men to perform functions or occupy posts requiring special abilities, responsibility, or courage. Leaders of military formations, commanders of armored trains, armored cars and railway stations, specialized workers, mechanics, lathe workers, gun mounters, etc., were continually being drawn from among the Kronstadters who were ready for any sacrifice. when the Kaledin uprising in the south became serious, Kronstadt again sent considerable forces against it, which contributed significantly to the destruction of the enemy and left many of their own men on the battlefield. Later on, a certain number of sailors, returning from the revolutionary fronts for various reasons, came back to Kronstadt and reorganized themselves there, but this was only an insignificant handful. The principal force was scattered all over the immense country. Kronstadt was not the same city anymore." Unquote. And according to many sources, already in 1918, the composition of the base had changed drastically. And this is because the civil war started in the early months of 1918, and a lot of the Kronstadt guys were some of the earliest to be sent away. So already in 1918, there were dramatic changes to the composition of the Kronstadt sailors, but of course the issue kept getting worse throughout 1919 and even throughout 1920. Getzler writes, quote, "On 23rd of September 1918, Ivan Flerovsky, the General Commissar of the Baltic Fleet, complained to Efroim Sklyansky, a member of the College of the People's Commissariat for War, that the very best and most reliable elements had been taken away from Kronstadt and from the fleet in general, and begged for a short period of grace so that new cadres could be trained by the old hands." Unquote. And Soviet writer Pukhov, who Getzler uses as a source, writes that, quote, "The beginning of the process of gradual change in the social composition of sailors in the Baltic Fleet can be attributed to the middle of 1918, unquote. And he also says that after that, quote, "No political demands were made to the new sailors. Class selection did not exist anymore," unquote. And that's just because of the great shortage of troops. Also at this point, the fleet began to attract people from non-worker and non-leftist backgrounds, and people joined it because it usually had better conditions and because it was far from the front lines. And this is when the future leader of the mutiny, Petrychenko, joined the fleet, and he actually joined it as a white-collar employee. And eventually, of course, Kronstadt started to get reinforcements to replace the old sailors who had been sent away. And according to Pukhov, one entire detachment of the new reinforcements were composed from deserters from other units, which meant that they were some of the most unreliable elements. And he also says that many of them were from wealthier families. And the size of the fleet was about 20,000, I think. And among the almost 4,000 new reinforcements who arrived in December 1920, almost all were from Ukraine, from nationalist or anarchist territories, and there were only 10 communists among them. And I'm sure that these kinds of data are why Avrich states that bulk of the new recruits were from Ukraine, and that some of them had belonged to various anti-Bolshevik armies, which includes Ukrainian nationalists, anarchists, and whites. And according to Pukhov on page 162, 60% of the new officers to the fleet were from either bourgeois or aristocrat backgrounds, and thus they had to be controlled by political commissars. Pukhov also states that the sailors constantly received letters from their peasant families, and that those letters contained many complaints about war communism. He gives examples of various letters. He says that in one letter, the peasants complained that their horse was taken for the army. In a different letter, some people say that their father was arrested for 3 days for questioning, etc., etc. So they make various kinds of complaints, which causes discontent among the troops. And then Pukhov also gives examples of corruption. He says that Zinoviev and also one of the Trotskyist commissars named Raskolnikov irritated the sailors with their actions. And all these examples provided by Pukhov have been used by capitalist historians such as Getzler. So whenever communists criticize corruption or some kind of other things like that, the capitalists always take those criticisms and then try to make it an example of how communism is bad. Katkov writes that, quote, "By 1921, of course, a large proportion of the men who were serving in 1917 had left Kronstadt. Their place had been taken by new recruits," unquote. But then Katkov tries to say that this doesn't really have any significance. But that's just because he is bourgeois. I think it does actually have a significance. Getzler says that party educator Yasinski, quote, "interviewed some 400 naval recruits drawn from the areas of the Kuban, Novorossiysk, Grodno, Vitebsk, Olonetsk, and Petrograd, many of whom had come, quote-unquote, straight from the plow. Yasinski was aghast to find that these confident-looking, reasonably well-fed and dressed lads including a few party members, were politically ignorant, if not illiterate, worlds removed from the highly politicized veteran Kronstadt sailors who had so deeply impressed him. He says, the recruits knew that Russia was a federal and socialist republic, though many could not explain the word federal, and they were aware that the Communist Party existed and ruled, but only 10 out of 100 could even vaguely explain communism, unquote. So, because there are so many of these sources and they come from a variety of backgrounds, Getzler is just a capitalist, same with Katkov, Pukhov is a communist, Volin is an anarchist, and there's so much of this data that talks about the dramatic change in the Kronstadt sailors, I don't think it can be denied. However, Getzler tries. So, Getzler claims that most of the sailors in 2 large Kronstadt battleships were quote-unquote veterans of the revolution. And why does he say that? Well, he says that because most of them had been recruited in 1917 or 1918 or earlier, therefore they must have been revolutionary veterans. However, this is not actually true, because it just shows when they were conscripted by the Tsar, by Kerensky, or by the Red Army, or some other army, but it doesn't actually show that they were revolutionary veterans. In fact, the opposite is the case. Quote, Yuri Shetinov shows that the crew of the Petropavlovsk battleship was reduced from nearly 1,400 to just 200 by late 1918. So during the year 1918, almost everybody was gone. He continues, the majority of the replacements were not veteran Kronstadters, but conscripts, former crewmen of the Navy, merchant marine and river vessels, who had quit after the revolution rather than serve voluntarily in the newly constituted Red Army, unquote. So while a lot of them had indeed been recruited in 1917, 1918 or even earlier, they had just been conscripted into the imperialist war, and once the revolution happened, they just went home as soon as possible. They didn't become revolutionaries. And then a lot of them were re-conscripted by the Red Army. They didn't volunteer for the Red Army, and they had been home during the revolutionary events. Pukhov also says on page 156 that many old conscripts who had served under the Tsar and who had gone back to their villages and returned to peasant life were brought back into the fleet later. So this is why even some of the old-timers who were brought back weren't actually proletarian revolutionaries who volunteered, but they were just average peasant conscripts who didn't want to fight voluntarily for anybody. And Pukhov also says that badly performing conscripts from the Red Army were sent to Kronstadt because Kronstadt needed a lot more people, and the other army units really didn't have many troops to give and didn't want to give many troops, but since they had to give some, they just gave the worst ones. So I think this completely explains all of Getzler's statistical falsifications. Getzler's information is clearly very lacking, and he tries to fill the gaps with just his own inventions and assumptions. But if somebody wanted to make the case that there was no change or no significant change in the fleet or in the Kronstadt sailors, Getzler's data is definitely the strongest, and it's still very weak. The data that he uses is fundamentally flawed because of the reasons I already gave, but it also only accounts for 10% of the sailors and leaves out 90% of the sailors. So it could also just give a very misleading picture because of that too. When we examine his claims together with the other data, his claims just don't really hold up. And furthermore, Getzler cites Pukhov as a source in order to claim that the Kronstadt sailors in 1921 were mostly the same as those in 1917, but this is not accurate at all. He completely misrepresents what Pukhov says. This is what Pukhov actually says. Thus, the fleet and the fortress found themselves in the power of the petty bourgeois elements, in the power of anti-communist sentiments vigorously fueled by the enemies of the dictatorship of the proletariat, SRs, Mensheviks, anarchists and outright white guards. The path to an armed uprising was cleared. Only a pretext was needed for it. Such a pretext was the rally of sailors, Red Army soldiers and citizens of Kronstadt on March 1st, 1921, which adopted the SR resolution, which signified the beginning of the counter-revolutionary mutiny of the sailors against the Soviet government. What were the immediate reasons that pushed the Baltic sailors to an armed adventure against the dictatorship of the working class? From all that has been said above, 3 immediate reasons follow. 1. The social change in the appearance of the personnel of the Baltic fleet and the filling of the ships and units with a petty bourgeois D-classed anarchist element. 2. Intensified process of disintegration of the fleet due to difficulties in supplying it with all types of provisions, almost complete combat inactivity and the deterioration of the political and moral state of the personnel, increasing influence of the village on the sailors in the form of leaves, letters, etc. And finally, 3. The decomposed party organization, the extremely bad state of political work in the fleet, and the weak political leadership, unquote. The bad party work refers to the struggle between the Zinovьevist and Trotskyist elements in the party, which were fighting amongst themselves. So, Getzler only has very few sources, and the best sources he has, such as Pukhov, he completely misrepresents. Now, we must ask ourselves, if the truth was on his side, would he need to do that? However, what I have learned from studying history is that there's always going to be some contradicting information, but I think the evidence is pretty strongly stacked in favor of the hypothesis that there was a big change in the fleet.
Kronstadt 1921 was not the first mutiny by the fleet, not even the first during the Revolution. There had already been a mutiny in 1918.
He's saying that this happened in October 1918, not October 1917. In 1917, they carried out the October Revolution. A year later, the composition of the sailors might already have changed 10 times over. I'm not even kidding. Many industrial workplaces and many party chapters had to mobilize and send half or most of their members to the front, sometimes 10 times a year. The number of proletarians in St. Petersburg dropped by like 60% or something, because all the workers were sent to the front. So there was a lot of changes in the composition of the proletariat of given cities and the composition of different military units. Getzler writes about, as far as I know, the most significant previous mutiny in Kronstadt, which happened in early 1919. And this is what happened in that mutiny. Quote, Kronstadt's tight and seemingly well-functioning communist system was put to the test in May to June 1919 with the advance towards Petrograd of General Udovicki-Selb's Northwestern Army. Even as that threatened, there came on 13th of June, and in anticipation of the Whites' approach, the mutiny of Krasnaya Gorka, now Kronstadt's only mainland fort. This was a terrible shock to Kronstadt's communist authorities, for, with the exception of a detachment of sailors and a communist company, the entire Krasnaya Gorka garrison of some 1,300 defected, including the commandant, Colonel Nikolai Nekhlyudov, and I'm pretty sure that Nekhlyudov was a Tsarist, but he goes on, the chairman of the Communist Party Collective, Stepan Urban, and such veteran Kronstadt Soviet stalwarts as the Left SR, Ludwig Grimm and N. Prisalkov. Many of the fort's gunners even went so far as to boast that they were SRs and would overthrow the Bolsheviks as our Central Committee has resolved. Colonel Nekhlyudov's radio message to Kronstadt and all its forts was simple: the commissarocracy has been overthrown in the Krasnaya Gorka fort, come and join us. A worse shock was in store on 16th of June when, after a supreme military effort in which Kronstadt sailors played a prominent part, Krasnaya Gorka was recaptured. Practically the entire garrison had joined the Whites, unquote. And, quotes, in Kronstadt itself, the Cheka uncovered and liquidated a conspiratorial anti-Soviet organization of officers, including Captain Alexander Rybaltovsky, chief of staff of the Kronstadt naval base, and the senior artillery officer Yuvenali Butkevich and Kuprianov, and some members of the intelligentsia, unquote. So, if you want to talk about earlier mutinies, these earlier mutinies don't paint a picture of an extremely socialist and leftist fleet, which just constantly was fighting for better and purer socialism. Instead, they paint a picture of a fleet whose class composition was rapidly decaying to the point that there had already been a serious mutiny where a big chunk had joined the Whites outright, and they had used similar slogans to those which were later used by the Kronstadt mutineers of 1921, saying, oh yeah, the commissarocracy has been overthrown, etc. And that mutiny was carried out by Whites, left SRs, right SRs, and other such forces, various Tsarist officers of the military base.
Another piece of information indicating that the Kronstadt mutineers did not represent the best revolutionary elements, but actually some of the worst, most politically backward elements, was their rampant anti-Semitism.
Finbal pushes the normal anti-Semitism accusation, and
Badmouse says that the anti-Semitism of the Kronstadt rebels is just anecdotes that don't basically mean a whole lot. Sure, they are anecdotes. He then goes on to say that there were other instances of anti-Semitism in the Red Army. That is entirely true, of course, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia in general. The White Guards were the most anti-Semitic. Jewish organizations were the least anti-Semitic. The Bolshevik Party was also very against anti-Semitism, but of course they recruited hundreds of thousands of people, so some people in there might have been anti-Semitic, and they recruited millions of people into the army, most of whom were peasants, and some level of anti-Semitism wasn't all that uncommon. But the point that I was making with this claim was just another demonstration of how the people who carried out the mutiny were not the most class-conscious proletarians. Instead, they were kind of average peasant conscripts, or maybe even below average.
the conclusion for analysing the revolt should never be to say that our side was the best, our side would have definitely created real socialism, but rather that it exposes the nature of the Bolsheviks.
Badmouse has a video called The Defeatist Arguments of Stalinism, which I have not seen, but I think what he's saying here is kinda defeatist, because he's basically saying that the Bolsheviks were bad and everybody else was bad too. In general, I think this whole thing is a bit pointless because he's not really defending anything, he's just criticizing communism. And I understand what he's saying. He's saying that since he doesn't really have a side, he can basically say whatever. He doesn't really have to care about supporting his own side or something, because he doesn't have a side. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, but then I just have to ask, like, what is the point? One of the things that I find the most interesting is why people think the things they do and also how they change their minds. And I've often thought about the things that I believe and the things that I have believed and then how I've changed my mind. And I've tried to figure out how exactly that happens. And it's a difficult question, but it obviously has to do with a certain kind of mindset. Because Badmouse is, to a large extent, looking at the same evidence that I'm looking at, but he's interpreting it in a very different way from me. And even certain things that I say, I understand them one way, and he understands them a completely different way. And I think the only explanation for that is some kind of fundamental difference in mindset. I know that he used to be an anarchist, and then he stopped. He says he became ML. I don't really know what exactly he means by that, and then he says that he stopped being ML as well. I find it curious, especially when he talks a little bit more about it here. Let's see.
Since then, many people refer to so-called Kronstadt moments. Present-day, real-life showcases of an ideology in action which led to their disillusionment of Marxist-Leninist beliefs.
The idea that because of the Kronstadt mutiny you would become disillusioned with Marxism-Leninism. I mean, did that happen to anybody? I'm being serious here, because Badmouse says that anarchists supported the uprising. He says that Emma Goldman became disillusioned with the Soviet government, but she was never a communist, she was always an anarchist. Because I think the uprising happens and the Bolsheviks see that the capitalist forces are behind it and the sailors who carry out the uprising are kind of just these hapless tools and proxies of the capitalists, a lot of the time even completely unknowingly. But then I guess anarchists and some other people, they don't really see it that way. They think that this is some kind of heroic moment and the fact that it was repressed was not like some kind of necessity, but was some kind of totally disillusioning moment. I think maybe it comes down to expectations, because I was raised to be very anti-communist, so I always had very low expectations of communism, and then when I became interested in politics, I just gradually became more and more Marxist and more Marxist-Leninist. So I never had this very romantic view of communism where if there's one uprising against it, I'm just disillusioned. I understand how the world is. Things are very complicated. It's completely possible to have a proletarian revolution and then have some people oppose it, even if their interest would be to support it, or what have you. Like, why do some workers support right-wing ideology? Well, because of lack of class consciousness. It's not surprising to me. Why would it be disillusioning?
I don't think I had any specific straw which broke the camel's back. It was a very protracted process for me, but I think if I had to point to a historic event that really got my gears turning, it would probably have been the Hong Kong protests. Where, hoping that I would find some nuanced and enlightening perspectives on this mass discontent, I ended up seeing time and time again just completely irrelevant points alongside a certain aversion to critically think. That they were all just coming from the preconceived standpoint of China is right, China is socialist, defend China at all costs.
Yeah, I find this very strange, this whole point. This is maybe even more interesting than the bulk of the video. I have to say, when the Hong Kong protests were happening, I always thought, and I even said, that I'm sure that the working class in Hong Kong is fighting for its own rights. They might not be like super class conscious, they might not be socialists or something, but I generally don't believe that every worker movement in China or something is like completely created by the CIA. I just don't think that that's feasible. The Kronstadt mutiny, however, is something very different. Because it's much easier to see the Kronstadt mutiny as basically a conspiracy in a military base. If we were talking about, say, worker protests against the Soviet government in Petrograd, well, I would say that the Mensheviks were leading it and trying to foster it, but obviously there's objective conditions that give rise to it. The Mensheviks didn't just create it out of thin air. I still think that the Mensheviks were wrong to try to mislead people into fighting against the Soviet government. But I think the case with China is different, because China is a capitalist country, it's not a socialist country, so I don't think workers are wrong to resist the Chinese government.
Instead of explaining the actions of the police, they instead just decided to highlight conservative hypocrisy, ironically ignoring their own. Statements were being made against the protesters that they weren't as peaceful as the media claimed they were. But such pearl-clutching seemed very conservative and contradictory.
Badmouse is right that that is a weird argument. But the thing is, he's talking about Dengists, he's not talking about MLs. It makes all the difference. Are you using violence against a socialist government? Or are you using violence against a capitalist government? That makes all the difference. Now, you might say that that's stupid, but it's not, because otherwise we would just be talking in the abstract, like violence in the abstract or non-violence in the abstract. But it makes all the difference.
And today I think back to stuff like the CPUSA response to the Sino-Soviet split, or indeed the way that the Bolsheviks responded to Kronstadt, and how if I were a contemporary of any of these events, I would have had to have believed outright lies.
I think what you consider lies, that's part of your worldview. Certain facts, I don't think they are lies, but you somehow see them as lies. I don't think that my view of the Kronstadt mutiny is lies. You can believe whatever you want, but I think we're both looking at a lot of the same things and you are interpreting it in a certain way. I think you're interpreting it in kind of an abstract and kind of a capitalist way, because you're saying that, well, they didn't want to collaborate with the whites, they just ended up doing that by accident or something. But I don't really care if that's what they wanted to do. I'm just saying that objectively speaking, they were serving capitalist interests. And I think my point of view is a Marxist point of view. And I don't really know if you can really disagree with that all that much, considering that you also condemn most of the stuff that the Kronstadt mutineers ended up doing. And when it comes to the CPUSA, well, why do you have to believe lies, though? I mean, you don't have to believe what the CPUSA says. Or you can, if you end up doing that somehow. Or you can find some third alternative, I suppose.
Imagine that the Kronstadt revolt was a full-on anarchist revolt, that there was no anti-Semitism present at all, that they all put forward unequivocal socialist demands, and that they all went down to the bitter end instead of retreating. Would you still believe that the Bolsheviks were right in crushing the revolt? The answer to this more foundational question is yes.
Yeah, that is a good question. The answer is probably yes, but there's two caveats to that. The first one is that obviously there were some real anarchist movements, such as the Makhno movement, and I think that there were certain concrete reasons why the Bolsheviks needed to put an end to it. But let's imagine that those didn't exist. Let's imagine that Makhno is just doing his anarchism. Would I still oppose it and support communism instead? Almost certainly I would, but not for any abstract reason, not just because I prefer communism or something. No, it's because as a Marxist, I fundamentally believe that anarchism is never going to work, and it's just going to result in the restoration of capitalism. And you can reply by saying, well, the Soviet Union was also destroyed and became capitalist. Well, yeah, that's true, but the Soviet Union got a lot further in building socialism than Makhno did. So, yeah, you can criticize certain mistakes of the Soviet Union, but still, it seems like it had a lot more to offer than Makhno.
The Hungarian Revolution and Prague Spring both happened in a position of far more power and solidity than there ever was during the Civil War. And yet, those actions are still put forward as necessary to be crushed for the same reasons.
Yeah, but I don't really support the Soviet intervention into Czechoslovakia. That's such a complicated topic that I cannot possibly go into it. I will at some later point. But I will say about Hungary that You can't deny that there was a real white terror going on, like real pogroms and all that, and also that Hungary was going to secede from the Warsaw Pact and possibly join NATO. They wanted the UN to militarily intervene and whatnot. I'm not going to go into it, but it was a much more serious situation than probably any other anti-Soviet movement since the Lenin era. You shouldn't equate every movement, because I understand what he's saying now. He thinks that maybe this is what his tanky video is about. I haven't actually seen that one either, but I think maybe that's what this is about. Like, he thinks that being an ML just means that you support whatever the Soviet Union does, or whatever China does. But that is not the case. If you have a socialist state, then you should support it, and if it's doing socialist policies, you should support that. If they make mistakes, you should criticize it. But if you have a revisionist or capitalist state, why would you support it? Because that's the difference between Marxist-Leninist and revisionist, is that revisionists are the people who, they just support whatever the Soviet Union does, regardless of what it is. Or they support whatever China does, regardless of what it is. But that's pointless. If you want socialism, you should support socialism. It's not about being a fan of the Soviet Union or fan of China. And the reason that I understood this at one point was because I studied the history of the communist movement, and I saw that the same parties, revisionist parties, they supported Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, even though the policies were completely different. Gorbachev's ideology is different than Brezhnev's ideology. Brezhnev, he's basically a fake Marxist-Leninist. Gorbachev is not even that. Gorbachev is something way stupider than that. He is very blatantly not a real Marxist. He's not doing a very good job of pretending to be a Marxist. But they still supported it. And that is a certain kind of mindset. And then obviously when the Soviet Union fell, usually those parties no longer supported Gorbachev, or they maybe didn't even support the Soviet Union anymore. But some of those same people, they now support Putin, or they support China. And I understand that it is a certain kind of mindset, is that you just support a given state, whether it be Stalin's USSR, Brezhnev USSR, Gorbachev's USSR, Putin's Russia. But what sense does that make? That's not Marxism. That's something weird. Obviously, there's different degrees to that. Some people support Stalin, but they also support Brezhnev, but they don't like Gorbachev. Some people like Brezhnev, but they don't like Putin. Or there's like some variation in this. But to an extent, it seems like it's more about just supporting some country and not really supporting the actual policy. And I think it is because of a fundamental lack of analysis of like the economy and the class character of a given state. That's why they support China, a country which is not socialist but claims to be a socialist country, and why they support Russia, a country which doesn't even claim to be socialist, is because they just don't care or are incapable of doing analysis of the class character of the state. Of course, they have other excuses too. They say Russia is an anti-imperialist state or whatnot. They come up with all kinds of justifications, but I understand what you're saying. Basically, you're saying that you oppose that. You oppose this weird thing where you support a country no matter what. But that's not Marxism. That's not Marxism-Leninism. To me, it's very odd that you abandon Marxism-Leninism because of a thing like that.
Because Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists always put forward the consolidation of the revolution before anything else, and that any fracture might pose a threat to their power.
When it comes to socialist states like Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, what have you, there were times when there was more repression, the Great Purge, the anti-rightist campaign, what have you. Then there's times when there's less repression and there's a more relaxed attitude. 100 Flowers campaign in China. A lot of historians say that in the USSR, like the early to mid 30s were actually a very chill time. Or that during the war, they tolerated a lot of differences of opinion. So there's this like back and forth between more freedom of debate and then more harder line. So it's not really a static thing. And if you look at like the Cultural Revolution, it's kind of a combination of both. In a sense, there's more freedom of discussion. The state authority is actually very weak at times. There's also times when the fight for the political line is very intense. Disagreement is always relative. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. Now to conclude, at the end of the day, I don't think it's a coincidence that the capitalists and all kinds of anti-Bolshevik leftists agree about so many things. And I don't think it's a coincidence that capitalists support all non-Leninist kinds of leftism against Leninism. They might not recognize it, but it's an objective tendency that happens, is that once the communist revolution happens and they start turning against it, they just end up on the capitalist side. And it's misguided to claim that it's the fault of the communists. The Bolsheviks, they of course first banned the capitalist cadet party. After that, the Mensheviks and SRs joined the Whites, and then eventually they were also banned, more or less. And other groups in the middle eventually either joined the Whites or joined the Reds. And that is just an objective process that happens. I think it's also misguided to claim that Leninism has failed and that it should be replaced with some kind of pluralist socialism. It's not a coincidence that all the great revolutions have been Leninist. There have been others, of course. In Venezuela, there was an attempt to make a peaceful, non-Leninist version of socialism, but it hasn't been successful, and at any rate, it's been much less successful than Leninism. All the non-Leninist revolutions have either quickly failed or degenerated. Opponents of Leninism usually say, okay, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, but the Leninist countries are still the farthest we've ever advanced towards socialism. Opponents of Leninism blame the collapse of the USSR on Leninism and not on anti-Marxist and anti-Leninist revisionism, even though, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed not when it was Leninist, but when it turned against Leninism, and their own solution is simply to replace Leninism with some kind of revisionism, despite the fact that revisionism is the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, and despite the fact that revisionist leaders, for example Gorbachev, advocated similar ideas to other opponents of Leninism. It's true that the Soviet Union fell, but today we are more equipped to oppose revisionism if we just study its essence well enough and understand it, and if we see how dangerous revisionism truly is. Of course, it's very annoying that there isn't some kind of easy solution, some kind of perfect socialism that doesn't have any of these difficulties, but such things simply don't exist. The more we study history and current reality, the more clearly that is demonstrated. Where are the great anti-Leninist revolutions of today? Are they perhaps in the poorest countries of the world, at the front lines of revolution? No, of course not. In India, Brazil, and other countries of South America and Asia, it is predominantly Leninists, or to be specific, Maoists, who are currently waging revolution. And not if, but when the next communist revolution succeeds, we need to support it. The revolution in Nepal, for example, which is one of the major revolutions of our era, eventually failed because of revisionism. And sometimes revolutions fail simply because of relations of class forces. So in that sense, the old problems still exist. In my opinion, Badmouse is not wrong in questioning economic incentives and economic inequality and bureaucracy in socialism. I think the greatest dangers of revisionism lie exactly there. And that is why we must learn from the mass mobilizations of the USSR and also from China under Mao and other such examples, because there were always serious attempts to fight against corruption, to fight against bureaucracy, and to fight against inequality. This topic is of course too broad to be discussed here, but it should be kept in mind that of course the inequality in the USSR was very little compared to capitalist countries, and Lenin and Stalin had every reason to create a level of economic incentive for the people so that the country would become industrialized. But Stalin also put in place regulations to prevent the rise of capitalism. For example, after World War II, he increased the taxes on private plots and decreased the taxes on collective plots to give people more incentive to work collectively and less incentive to work privately. But after his death, the revisionists gradually started to do the opposite, which sponsored private production and was part of the shift towards eventual capitalism. Economic incentives should be more and more replaced by ideological motivators, but there is a time and place for everything. It's not possible to do that completely right away, even though there of course were examples of it since the very beginning. And we also shouldn't romanticize absolute egalitarianism too much because to a large extent that was also a problem in war communism too. When people criticize communism, they often come at it from different angles. There are some people who criticize the relative inequality, then there are some people who criticize the lack of economic incentive, and oftentimes there's some basis to what they're saying, but it's still wrong, and it's very difficult to satisfy all these criticisms. In war communism, people couldn't produce privately, they couldn't buy or sell, there were basically no large differences in wages. Heck, money basically ceased to exist. And some people thought that it was fantastic. Some people thought that it was absolute utopia. But these days, do we hear a lot of statements about how great it was? No, we don't, even though some people would like to repeat a lot of those ideas. During war communism, economic incentive was to a large extent pointing towards the black market or towards corruption, because, of course, you could produce, but you knew that it would just be given to the military, which of course was necessary, but that just meant that you didn't have much of an incentive. And there were people who engaged in subotniks or voluntary labor, but again, there's no monetary compensation from that. Some people did it just to help out, and Communist Party members were required to do it. While it was necessary to basically put the whole country on war footing and absolutely mobilize all available resources for the war effort, it still caused its own problems. But then when war communism was removed, was everything just hunky-dory? Was everything just utopia? No. Private buying and selling and private production was allowed, even if on a small scale, but it still starts to automatically create capitalism. If you allow some level of economic competition, it eventually gives rise to the new capitalists. And sure, there's the party, and the party can just arrest them and expropriate them and take their property away and whatnot. But that's not going to be enough, and if you let the situation remain like that, it will eventually begin to influence and infiltrate the party itself, and the party itself will become a capitalist party, just like has happened in modern China. If that goes on, it will happen. And people can advocate for some kind of anarchist communes which forbid private production but basically allow everything else. And it will still lead to capitalism, because the people will have an economic incentive to engage in private sale and private production, and capitalism will eventually be restored. Or you'll have to crack down on it. For cooperatives and collective farms and communes and whatnot, you also have to give people some kind of economic reason and an ideological reason to do it. So what's the solution then? Well, I think that the solution is that there has to be a party which retains ties with the masses, doesn't only lead the masses but also learns from the masses and replenishes itself from the masses. And of course that's a very tall order, but that has to be done. And the party must also adjust its policy according to the situation. It must create enough economic incentive to produce a rapidly developing country, but at the same time it must stamp out capitalism. It must make economics work in its favor, but not in the favor of capitalism. There has to be policies of increased incentive and social mobility, which improves people's lives, but also at the same time there has to be frequent campaigns towards equality, against the rich and against capitalist ideology. So it can't just be one thing, that you either just promote full-blown communism right away or something, or just let the market do its thing. No, I don't think the policy can remain the same. I think there has to be shifts of emphasis towards production and towards ideological struggle and towards production and ideological struggle. That's the way I see it. And it probably won't be easy. Over time, it'll become easier as socialism defeats capitalism worldwide, but easy alternatives probably don't really exist. The easy answers are always just incoherent and fundamentally capitalist distractions. It took capitalism many centuries to win predominance against feudalism, and of course the capitalist revolution is not the same kind of revolution as the socialist revolution. They are not 100% analogous, but still we shouldn't be discouraged by the fact that socialism hasn't defeated imperialism yet. With each step we've gotten closer to final victory, and I think we're on the brink of the new revolutionary wave, which will put an end to capitalism forever.